Chapter 10. I hadn't spoken much with Vernon Presley yet, but since he was Elvis's father, I hoped he would like me. It was hard for me to find time to talk alone with Vernon, because whenever he was in our suite, he mostly talked with Elvis. He only occasionally asked me a question or directed a comment my way. We couldn't converse during Elvis's shows, and backstage, with Sandy at his side, Vernon was usually busy talking with guests. December 8 proved to be a horrible night when, after Elvis's show, Vernon collapsed in the backstage dressing room. Elvis, myself, Dr. Guynham, Sandy, and Joe rode with him to Sunrise Hospital, where Vernon was rushed into the emergency room, followed closely by Dr. Guynham and Sandy. While we waited, Elvis found an empty wheelchair in a mostly vacant corridor and sat down in it. Someone placed a chair beside him for me, and I sat down too. I noticed Elvis's eyes get misty, and he lightly wiped them with the back of his hand. I placed my arm around him, wanting to comfort him any way possible. One night earlier, I'd been afraid I might lose my grandfather. Now here was Elvis, in a similar situation with his own father. I knew how helpless he must feel. Here was a man who thought he could do anything, yet this was beyond his reach. I wished there was something I could do for Elvis, the way he had offered to help me. At this moment, all I had to give him was my love, and that's what I gave. We said prayers in the hallway as we waited for news. Sandy finally walked out and explained that Vernon had fluid buildup in his lungs, but otherwise he was doing all right. She also mentioned that he would definitely have to stop smoking. Dr. Guynham joined us then, relaying similar information. He tried to reassure Elvis and put him at ease. I waited while Elvis went in to see his father. Afterward, the doctors requested that Vernon stay in the hospital overnight. I had seen Elvis be pensive before, but during our ride back to the Hilton, he was dead quiet. I was determined to comfort him and respect his feelings any way I could. If Elvis wanted to think in silence, I was there to keep him company, or if he wanted to talk, I was there to listen. As we returned to our suite, Ricky Stanley was waiting for us. He immediately walked up to Elvis and hugged him. Ricky then surprised me with a hug and said, "Thank you for being here, Ginger." It meant a great deal to me, hearing that. I was grateful if, in some small way, I had actually helped Elvis in a time of need. A little later, Elvis decided he wanted to meditate. Not surprising, I thought, on such an emotional night. He asked Larry and Charlie to join us in our room, where the four of us sat on the bed, held hands, and visualized colors, our hearts and minds focused on healing Vernon Presley. The following evening, my stomach became unsettled. Whether this was from the tension I'd felt during the previous night or from something else, I had no idea. Not wanting to worry Elvis, I decided to try a self-healing. We had been reading in bed together. Now I left Elvis and went into the bathroom, where I shut the door and stretched out on the carpeted floor. I took some deep breaths, focused on a color, and concentrated on feeling better. When my stomach felt less queasy, I returned to our room. Elvis was still in bed, reading, and as I settled in place beside him, he looked up from his book. "Why were you lying on the floor?" he asked. Completely mystified, I asked, "How did you know I was on the floor?" Without saying a word, Elvis winked and smiled that satisfied, knowing smile I was becoming familiar with, a smile that intimated some type of sixth sense. I felt my eyes go wide. Had Elvis somehow performed a healing on me from a distance, through a closed door? I was beginning to believe in certain powers, despite the fact that logic told me otherwise. Now I remembered how Elvis had once said he knew what was about to happen and where, as if he had the gift of second sight. Had he just demonstrated that gift to me, or was it an innocent parlor trick? The longer I was with Elvis, the more anything seemed possible. I had enjoyed watching Elvis tease his band members on stage, and I'd grown accustomed to him changing the lyrics to certain songs in jest. However, during his next show, Elvis seemed to actually forget a few words. For a moment, I thought maybe he was simply bored by repeating some songs. I quickly dismissed the notion that he would turn in a subpar performance, though, because the Elvis I was getting to know only ever wanted to give his audience the best. Could his water pills or any pain medication be affecting his memory? It also seemed likely that, with Vernon in the hospital and so much going on around him, Elvis could forget a few words. I was slowly becoming aware of how unforeseen factors could affect a performance. I waited for Elvis in the dressing room after the show. Before long, he sent for me from the adjacent room. When I entered, I saw two gorgeous women dressed in fur coats seated on either side of a man, who Elvis introduced as Prince Adnan Khashoggi. The women seemed completely enthralled by Elvis, hanging on his every word as the men conversed. I sat beside Elvis and listened quietly. Prince Khashoggi and the ladies had no sooner left when Elvis turned to me and said, "I had to use the bathroom the whole time." As he hastened to the men's room, he glanced over his shoulder at me and grinned. "I bet that's the first time you ever saw a prince and a king in the same room together," he said. As the door closed behind him, I couldn't help but laugh. Our prayers were answered on Friday, December 10th, when Vernon was released from the hospital. Once Vernon was back at the Hilton, Elvis visited alone with his father in his room. Afterward, Elvis told me that he wanted his father to return to Memphis so he could rest from the hustle and bustle of Las Vegas. At the same time, Elvis was worried about Vernon being on the airplane and having a sudden relapse during the flight. Vernon argued that he was feeling well enough to remain in Las Vegas. In the end, Elvis agreed to let his dad stay through his last show. Meanwhile, Elvis decided he wanted me to have more clothing and arranged for me to go shopping with Joe's girlfriend, Shirley. She had been a cocktail waitress in Las Vegas, Elvis said, and really knew her way around. I was excited about the outing. Shirley was energetic and talkative. However, as we rode around Las Vegas in a car together, Shirley immediately brought up Elvis and began asking questions about the two of us. I wasn't one to open up with someone I didn't know. I certainly didn't want to discuss my relationship with Elvis with anyone outside my family. I kept the conversation light and easy, dodging her questions as gracefully as possible. Fortunately, before long we pulled up to a store called Susie Cream Cheese. It was a high-end boutique filled with clothing like nothing I'd ever seen back in Memphis. As I browsed through the apparel, Shirley occasionally handed me some pieces she thought were nice and picked out a few for herself. I ended up choosing some clothing that I hoped Elvis would like as well. Shirley paid for our new outfits with money I assumed Joe had given her from Elvis. We returned to the Hilton, and later that evening, Elvis sent his Lockheed Jetstar to Memphis, picking up my parents and siblings, my sister-in-law Carolyn, and Terry's boyfriend Tony. Billy Stanley, who had left after Elvis's Anaheim show, was on the flight too, along with the wife and the son of one of the bodyguards. Everyone arrived in Las Vegas in time for Elvis's second show. During portions of his first show, Elvis had performed some of his songs while seated on a stool. His leg was still not 100% pain-free, and I hoped he wouldn't injure it any further. Afterward, we returned to the suite so he could relax, and before long, I was told my family had arrived. Excited, I called their room, telling them I'd see them soon. Close to showtime, a bodyguard was sent to my family suite, and they were escorted downstairs. I slipped into a peach velvet gown, put on my evening shoes, and followed Joe back to the showroom. This time Joe left me to make my own way toward the usual booth. As I went to sit down, I did a double-take as I noticed my brother smiling at me. I had walked right past my family without recognizing them in the booth beside mine. Had I really been away from home that long? Had my new experiences with Elvis over the past weeks completely altered my perception? Realizing what I'd done, I quickly backed up and joined them. It was surreal but wonderful to gather my family around me here in Las Vegas. Finally, the people I loved were in one place. Vernon and Sandy soon entered, taking a seat in the booth beside ours. I had barely begun visiting with my family when the lights dimmed and Joe returned, telling me that Elvis wanted me to sit in the booth with his father. I was momentarily taken aback. Why didn't Elvis want me sitting with my own family? Knowing how ill Vernon had been, though, I whispered to my family, "I think Elvis wants me to keep Vernon and Sandy company," and moved to the next booth. As Elvis's intro theme began to play, I was excited for my family. Now they would experience the same incredible feeling I'd had the first time I saw Elvis's show as his guest instead of an audience member. Elvis appeared to put extra effort into his overall performance, and, other than a few sound problems, it was a good show. I was extremely happy and proud. A memorable moment in the show for me was when someone in the audience shouted, "Elvis, I love you," and he was quick to retort, "Ginger, is that you?" Elvis had mentioned my name in front of the crowd, and my family was right here. Afterward, my family was escorted to the penthouse suite, and I stayed behind with Elvis in his dressing room so he could change. He stepped out looking incredibly handsome in a blue silk shirt, black pants, and black boots. As usual, he greeted others who'd been waiting and chatted graciously with them. Once we were in the elevator and heading up to the penthouse, however, I could tell by his nervous mannerisms and little things Elvis said that he was anxious about meeting my family. This was something I again found endearing, if hard to believe. This was Elvis. What did he have to feel nervous about? When we entered the suite, a bodyguard's wife who had one drink too many turned to look at Elvis and slipped off her stool at the bar, landing on the floor. Elvis looked slightly embarrassed as he approached my family. They were seated together on the couch. As I introduced each person in turn and Elvis asked how my sisters had been, I realized I had still never told Elvis that my father met him years ago when Elvis was first sworn into the Army. I related the story now. I also told Elvis that my siblings and I had met him at the fairgrounds when we were little. Elvis was genuinely surprised. I hadn't expected him to have any recollection of these memories. However, he looked long and hard at my dad and said, "Mr. Alden, I remember you now." He then went on, mentioning the Army before going on to discuss other things. Later, when we were alone, Elvis would bring up again that it was pretty neat my family and he had met earlier. At one point in the evening, Elvis asked someone to bring him the 3 wise men gifts he had received a few nights back, and the conversation turned spiritual. My mother told Elvis that her father had once been a preacher years back, which interested him, and they chatted a little more. He then politely asked my family if they would mind him continuing his visit with them the next evening, because he was tired but wanted to spend more time with them. He said he would like to treat them to a French showgirl revue called the Lido de Paris at the Stardust Hotel, then have them return to the Hilton to see his second show. The following night, my family went to see the Lido, and Elvis's ex-in-laws, the Beaulieus, along with their daughter Michelle and son Don, came to see Elvis perform during his first show. We were introduced backstage, and instead of being seated with Vernon in the showroom, I was surprised when this time Elvis placed me in a booth with the Beaulieus. Mr. Beaulieu was polite, briefly saying a few words to me, but I couldn't help but feel awkward throughout the entire show. Elvis and I eventually went back to the suite between performances. When I returned to the showroom, I saw that the Beaulieus had stayed to watch another show. My family was sitting, unknowingly, in a booth beside them. This time I was directed to sit with Vernon and Sandy. This decision baffled me a little, as Elvis had yet to seat me with my family. As always, though, I tried to keep an open mind when Elvis was concerned. By now I knew that Elvis did things in his own inexplicable way. Sometimes I would understand his thinking, and sometimes not. During the second performance, Elvis occasionally sat on a stool, still favoring one leg, but he had a good time and joked heavily with Charlie, which had everyone laughing. At one point, as he leaned over to kiss a member of the audience, Elvis hastily said, "Ginger, it's only part of the show." He had mentioned my name again. I was on cloud 9. Afterward, my family joined me in the dressing room, and I was finally able to freely chat with them. They were bowled over when I told them about my new car. Elvis visited with a few people in the adjacent room and kept others waiting, as usual, including my parents and the Beaulieus, neither of whom would be introduced to one another. Vernon and Sandy spoke with my parents at one point, and Vernon gave my father a cigar, telling him that his doctors had advised him to quit smoking. Elvis eventually visited with the Beaulieus. When they had gone, Elvis came out and greeted my family, this time inviting them back to the penthouse, where he gave them a tour of the suite while I waited in the living room. When they returned, he took me aside. "Put on your white gown and all your jewelry," he whispered in my ear. I went into my bathroom and did as he requested. Taking one last look in the mirror, I literally glittered from head to toe. Feeling as regal as any princess, I stepped out and was gratified to see Elvis beaming at me from across the room. "There," he said to my family, "I want you to see your daughter in her true attire. It's little Ginger's time to shine." My family had seen me wear gowns at pageants, but this was the real thing, and they were full of compliments. Elvis left the room then, only to return carrying the framed reproduction of a painting of himself by the artist Loxie Sibley. After we'd admired it for a few moments, Elvis handed the painting to my father. "I want you to have it," he said, once again demonstrating how much he wanted to give to everyone around him. I thought Elvis would be tired after the show, but he continued to visit with my family for a long time, and I was happy to see him enjoying himself. At some point, the conversation turned to Elvis's love of karate. Gathering my family in a circle, Elvis said he wanted to display some techniques for them. He asked Ed Parker and Ricky Stanley to come into the room, then carefully placed Ricky in various positions as his victim, while Ed narrated what Elvis was doing. Ed was fascinating to listen to, and I was mesmerized. Elvis and Ed also demonstrated a few of their own karate moves on one another, and it was great to see Elvis apparently free from the pain he'd been suffering. It was all extremely entertaining, but it was quite late. My sister's boyfriend, Tony, eventually couldn't help himself and began to yawn. Elvis shot him a quick glance and said, "Am I boring you, son?" Extremely embarrassed, Tony abruptly closed his mouth and replied, "No." Elvis wrapped up the evening by telling us a story about Barbra Streisand approaching him to work on a remake of the film A Star is Born. There were 2 reasons he didn't want to do that film, Elvis explained. The first was that he didn't understand why the main character would kill himself. The second reason was that when Barbra Streisand and the producer John Peters discussed the movie with him, John had yawned. "Man, I just couldn't see him directing it," Elvis said. Sunday, December 12th, Elvis performed what would be his last show in Las Vegas. Wayne Newton, Lola Falana, Kay Stevens, and Michelle Lee were all in the audience. The presence of so many stars was an added gift for my brother, who, unbeknownst to Elvis, happened to be celebrating his 31st birthday that day. Elvis had a good time cutting up with Charlie on stage that night, and even though Charlie's birthday was a few days away, Elvis sang happy birthday to him. I only wished I had told him it was my brother's actual birthday, because if Elvis had acknowledged it from the stage, what a gift that would have been. Wayne Newton visited with Elvis in his dressing room, while Wayne's wife Elaine chatted briefly with me and my family. After they left, my parents thanked Elvis and returned to their rooms to pack. It was a little tough for me to say goodbye, but I remained with Elvis an extra day so he could rest, while my parents flew home on the Jetstar. As I looked back on our intense time together in Las Vegas, I wondered what it would be like when Elvis and I were finally apart in Memphis after spending so much intimate time together. We had shared our thoughts and feelings as we discovered new things about each other. He had even spoken of marriage. I had been magically transported into Elvis's world and inhabited it as fully as possible, learning much about his connection to his fans, his life as a performer, his entourage of close employees and friends, and his spiritual quest. In our exciting weeks together, Elvis had become my mentor, lover, and protector. He had rocked me not only musically, but physically and emotionally. My world, as I'd always known it, was forever changed, no matter what happened next. Chapter 11. I flew back to Memphis with Elvis on the Lisa Marie. As the plane touched down on familiar soil, it felt nice to be home. Yet I also felt slightly displaced after having lived in Elvis's world for almost 3 weeks nonstop. David Stanley, another of Elvis's stepbrothers and employees, was waiting to pick us up at the airport. He was close to my age, with long, shaggy, dark brown hair and a brawnier build than his two siblings. I had no trouble believing it when Elvis told me David's nickname was Magilla Gorilla. Driving toward Graceland down Elvis Presley Boulevard, as we neared the front gates, I saw a large nativity scene now sitting in the front yard. I had seen this nativity scene many times in the past. During my childhood, my family would drive around the area every Christmas, marveling at the holiday lights, as nearby neighborhoods tried to outdo one another with beautiful decorations. What seemed magical to me then was indescribably wonderful now as I viewed it seated next to Elvis. As we passed the life-size statues of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus in the manger, Elvis looked my way, shrugged his shoulders, and joked, "Who are those people?" Inside Graceland, one of the maids greeted us, and I noticed a Christmas tree standing in the dining room. From the foyer, I couldn't tell if it was real or not, but it was beautiful. I wondered who had decorated it. Just then, an older woman with an adorable honey-colored Pomeranian cradled in her arms entered the room and welcomed Elvis home. Elvis introduced her as Aunt Delta. I would later learn that she was Vernon's sister and had been living at Graceland since the 1960s. An aide carried the 3 wise men Elvis had been given inside and placed them in the foyer near the front door. Wordlessly, Elvis walked upstairs, and I followed him with the unspoken understanding that he expected me to accompany him to his bedroom. I still felt like a visitor on the outside looking in, but it seemed that, for Elvis, me being at Graceland was already the most normal thing in the world. Although we had taken an extra day in Las Vegas to relax at the Hilton, it had still felt like a whirlwind trip. Now that we were home, I could feel my adrenaline-fueled energy giving way to weariness. I thought Elvis must feel the same way, and would want to rest or just be away from the many people who had surrounded him for the past few weeks. Upstairs, Elvis immediately disappeared into his bathroom. I stood, waiting, unsure of what to do. I felt that I needed to go home, regroup, and reflect on all of the new experiences I'd had with Elvis, but I didn't want to leave if that would disappoint him. I also knew that, because Elvis and I had been together nonstop, I would miss him. Elvis returned from the bathroom, where he had changed into his usual pajamas and sat down on his bed. Picking up one of his books from the floor, he motioned me over to sit beside him. If this was what Elvis needed to relax, I was happy to stay until he was ready to go to sleep. However, as I took my place beside him while Elvis read, my eyes wandered to the pictures of Linda Thompson on the shelf. I wondered if he'd simply forgotten they were there. Shaking thoughts of Linda from my mind, I turned my focus back to Elvis. At one point, Elvis asked about my grandfather having been a minister and said he wanted to speak with my mother again. I called home, said a quick hello, and handed him the phone. Elvis dove right into a conversation with her about the Bible. "Have you ever noticed how the word history broken up means his story?" he asked, alluding to history being God's story. My mother had a strong spiritual faith. She had frequently read parts of the Bible to us, so I knew she'd enjoy this conversation. As they talked, it was interesting to hear some of Elvis's personal observations regarding the Bible. With all of the reading we had previously done, we had not yet touched upon this area. Their conversation lasted a few minutes, then Elvis abruptly changed the subject. "What kind of car do you drive?" he asked. As he sat quietly listening, I knew she was telling him about the Dodge Charger they had recently purchased. "That's your family car?" he asked. When the conversation ended and Elvis hung up, he seemed to be mulling over something. Looking my way, he announced, "I would like your parents to have a new car, a larger one." I didn't know what to say. He could render me speechless like nobody else. After thinking about it for a few minutes, Elvis asked, "Would you mind giving them the Continental? I have another car I want to give you." This took me totally by surprise. In the excitement of being with Elvis in Las Vegas and coming home to Memphis, I hadn't given the Continental a thought. In fact, I still hadn't even driven it. "That's fine," I said, amazed that Elvis would want my parents to have a new car. "But where is the Continental?" "It should be here," he said. "Someone was supposed to drive it to Memphis." "Oh, okay," I answered, smiling as I thought about how, in Elvis's world, magical things like this could just happen. The Continental was indeed delivered to Graceland. Now Elvis wanted me to drive it home. He called for an aide to escort me. Eager to surprise my parents, I took a seat behind the wheel of the car for the first time and began following Al Strada toward Graceland's gates. It was a surprisingly harrowing experience. I hadn't realized how big the car was until I was driving it. As I peered over the wheel, the Continental's expansive hood seemed to stretch out forever. It was basically a land yacht. As the car squeezed through the brick pillars and onto Elvis Presley Boulevard, I was worried about hitting any and everything. Keeping up with Al wasn't easy either. He was driving fast, so fast that I had the impression he was just trying to get this chore over with. I wondered if he was tired after the trip, too. Luckily, I made it home with no fender benders. My parents were at work when I arrived, but my sisters were in the house. It was comforting to see them. At the same time, it actually felt slightly surreal to be at home. I brought my sisters outside, and as they gasped at the sight of the gleaming white Continental, I told them that Elvis wanted me to give it to our parents. They were flabbergasted. They wanted to hear about Las Vegas when we headed back inside. As much as I wanted to tell them about it, I suddenly realized how exhausted I was. I explained that I needed to rest because Elvis was sleeping and might call when he woke up. This would be my only chance to get caught up on sleep. "Can I tell you all about it when Mom and Dad get home?" I asked, then retired to my bedroom. I was practically asleep before my head hit the pillow. I don't know how many hours I slept before there was a knock on my door. It was my mom. I walked with my parents outside, and, as they stared disbelievingly at the Continental, I repeated the words that Elvis had originally said to me. "It's yours." It was a priceless moment. I told my family as much as I could about what I'd experienced with Elvis, but I couldn't reveal everything, especially the inexplicable moments when I'd witnessed the self-healing or Elvis's attempts to move objects with his mind. I doubt they would have believed me anyway. In turn, they shared their own experiences in Las Vegas and how the trip had taken my mother's mind off her father's health for a bit. It was her first time on an airplane, and although she had a fear of flying, once we were inside the Jetstar, she said, I didn't think twice about it. My parents hadn't been inside the room at the Las Vegas Hilton long before there was a knock at their door. When they opened it, a man stood in the hallway, holding a vase of flowers he said were from Elvis. My mother thanked him and carried the vase into the room. When she turned back after putting the flowers on a table, she caught the man inching his way into the room. "Is Ginger your daughter?" he had asked. "Yes," she'd answered, startled. "Are she and Elvis going to get married?" he asked. Only then had my mother realized he was probably a reporter, and the flowers weren't really from Elvis at all. "I'm sorry," she told him, "but I can't answer any questions." The man had tried to step inside the room even more. "I practically had to close the door on him," my mother reported now. We laughed about the incident, but I was uncomfortable. Neither my family nor I had any preparation for dealing with the press. I hoped this sort of thing wouldn't happen again. That was one hope that would go unfulfilled. "Do you think I still have a job?" I asked her now. "When I spoke with them, they told me you did," she said. I breathed a sigh of relief. At least one small thing would still feel normal, now that I was back in Memphis. Later that night, Elvis called my house himself for the very first time. My father asked to speak with him. He thanked Elvis for the car, but told him they honestly felt awkward as it was such a large gift. It was fun seeing the expression on my dad's face because I could tell from his look of shock and confusion that Elvis was pressing him until he felt all right about accepting the car. When I got back on the line, Elvis invited me over. "I'll drive," I said, but Elvis, always the gentleman, insisted on sending someone to pick me up. Back at Graceland, I wasn't inside long when Elvis took my hand and asked me to walk downstairs with him. I followed him outside onto the porch, wondering what he was up to now. I was rapidly learning to expect the unexpected. Headlights suddenly appeared from around the side of the house as a gorgeous silver and maroon Cadillac Seville pulled up in front of us. An aide climbed out of the driver's seat, and Elvis turned to me. "Thanks for giving the Continental to your parents, Ginger," he said. "This is yours." I hugged Elvis, understanding now why he hadn't wanted me to drive myself to Graceland, then ran over to excitedly look over my new car. It was a customized version of Cadillac's newly introduced Seville with wire wheels, a chrome grille, and a built-in Citizen Band radio. Elvis explained that he had originally bought the car for his father. "My dad told me he didn't really have any use for it," he said. I couldn't help but wonder if Elvis had felt a little hurt about this. Early the next morning, I drove my Cadillac home and slept for a little while. My life had taken a completely new direction. Whether this direction was real and permanent or just a momentary illusion, I knew that I was willing to take a chance on the relationship I was developing with Elvis. When I woke, I made the phone call to Larry that I had promised Elvis I would make back when he asked me to stop seeing anyone else. I invited Larry to my home and made it clear that we couldn't see each other anymore. As hard as it was to do, I wanted to be with Elvis now, and I had to be truthful about that. That night, Elvis invited me back to Graceland. I found him seated on his bed. When I entered the room, he made a surprising announcement. "Linda Thompson called and asked if I was going to spend Christmas with her," he said. "Do you want to spend Christmas with me?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. He smiled at me. Good. I felt suddenly uncertain. Why was Linda still calling him? I'd thought his relationship with her was over. I was happy that Elvis was inviting me to spend Christmas with him, of course, but what would he have done if for some reason I'd been unable to? Would he have spent it with Linda? I'd just ended things with Larry and made a commitment to see how things progressed with Elvis. Why had he even told me about Linda's call? Did he want me to be jealous? Elvis seemed to be tracking my thoughts, which I suppose must have shown on my face, because he pointed to the pictures of Linda. "Why don't you take those down?" he instructed. Doing this would sure make me feel better. As I began gathering the photos, Elvis went on. "Linda placed those there a while ago when I was away," he said, and asked me to put the photographs in his office bathroom. I had no idea there was a bathroom off his office at that point. It was one room I'd never seen. I only knew about the bathroom adjoining his bedroom. Photos in hand, I walked into his office toward a closed accordion-style door. I had always thought this was a closet. Now sliding the door open, I stepped onto a floor covered in deep, bubblegum pink shag carpeting. In the open closet facing me hung a few items of women's clothing. Whose were they? My stomach was in a knot. Naive as I was back then, I'd had no idea a woman had been staying here with Elvis. Were they Linda's things, or some other woman's? To my right, makeup and toiletries were scattered across the counter. Liquid makeup had splattered along the bottom of the mirrored wall above it, making me wonder if there had been a small fight of some kind. A vanity chair was tucked beneath the counter, and on the left was a professional salon chair with built-in hairdryer. Beside that was another counter with a sink. That wall was also mirrored. A glass bath shower stall stood at the end of the bathroom, a misty green toilet across from it. A telephone was attached to the wall. The finishing touch was a tall vase filled with yellow and green feather plumes. I placed the pictures on the vanity chair, not knowing what else to do with them, and walked out, sliding the door shut. Back in the bedroom, I sat down beside Elvis, feeling disoriented and upset. Again, he read my emotions easily. Elvis took my hands in his. "You know, I never could picture myself married to Linda," he said. "She kept asking me, but I always thought that it was a man's place to ask." He added that Linda had been pursuing a career in California, saying, "Poor Linda, she's gone Hollywood." I began to relax a little. I had never been there, though, and said, "I think it would be fun to see Los Angeles one day." Elvis shot back, "You going to Hollywood would be like throwing pizza to hungry lions." I certainly had no plans to go to Hollywood, and appreciated that he was being protective of me. Elvis's pronouncement was a little confusing, though. Hollywood had been such a big part of his life when he was making movies. Did Elvis disapprove of it? Had something happened in Hollywood to make him feel that way? Elvis turned on the television and took my hand again. "You don't have to worry," he said. "I told you before, Linda and I are over. I'll see to it that the things in the bathroom are out of there. That bathroom should be for you to use." I relaxed. Clearly, Elvis intended for me to be spending a lot more time at Graceland. I was glad to hear it. Elvis wanted others around to pick up and go whenever and wherever. He wanted to have his employees at his beck and call. Hearing Al talk reminded me that even now, Al was at work for Elvis. Being at my home was a paid job. I could see where nights like this wouldn't necessarily be fun or exciting for an aide. When Elvis returned, I followed him outside. "Thank you for coming over," I said, as we walked together toward his motorcycle. "Your bike is beautiful." "I'll take you for a ride sometime," he said. Then, strapping his helmet back on, Elvis climbed onto his motorcycle. Al got into a waiting car. I stood on the lawn to watch them leave, smiling as I watched Elvis ride off into the night. A few days before Christmas, Elvis asked if I would help him shop for his relatives. He had arranged for Goldsmith's department store in Memphis to reopen after public hours. Goldsmith's was located in the Southland Mall, not far down the street from Graceland. Elvis's cousin Patsy Gamble and a bodyguard accompanied us. As we turned into the mall's parking lot, we were greeted by a police officer waiting in his car. One of the mall's security guards opened the door to Goldsmith's while the police officer waited outside. It felt eerie to walk through the department store, empty now, except for us and a few sales clerks patiently waiting for this one shopper. I had been in Goldsmith's many times, but this was shopping Elvis style and completely different. We had been in the store for only a few moments when Elvis said he'd like to buy me some nightgowns and robes. I was surprised that he wanted to buy something for me and by the intimate nature of the gifts. I followed Elvis and the guard to the lingerie department, where I browsed through the sleepwear while the men made small talk close by. During their chat, Elvis accidentally referred to me once as Sheila. He quickly caught himself and said Ginger. When I hastily turned around, wondering who Sheila was, Elvis glanced at me with a "sorry about that" look. This threw me for a moment, but I went back to shopping. It was only much later that I learned Elvis had dated a woman named Sheila Ryan for a few years, not long before meeting me. I selected some nightgowns and robes, then followed Elvis over to the fur coats section, where he began looking through the coats. He seemed to know what he liked, and I started to feel like he didn't really need me along as he picked out a coat and had Patsy try it on. Looking through a few more, Elvis singled out a black and white mink and one more made of white rabbit fur. He asked me to try them on so he could see if they would fit some of his relatives. I slipped into each coat and turned around, briefly modeling them while Elvis watched and mulled them over. He then purchased all of the coats while I browsed close by. Back at Graceland, Elvis gave Patsy the coat she had tried on, and I knew Elvis's other relatives would be pleasantly surprised by the gifts he had waiting for them. I wondered if he was this generous with his family every Christmas, and decided he probably was. Elvis was his family's real Santa Claus. In fact, I'd begun to see that every day with Elvis could feel like Christmas. I left Graceland shortly after sunrise. On the way home, I wondered what I could give Elvis for the holidays that he didn't already have. I couldn't possibly repay him in kind for the generous gifts he'd given my family and me. At first, because of everything we'd been reading, I considered having a special turban made with a large stone in its center, but I didn't think I'd have enough time. I went to sleep for a while, still pondering ideas, and later went shopping with Rosemary. In a nearby mall, I finally purchased a gold chain necklace with a large cross made out of a gemstone called Tiger's Eye. It was a simple gift compared to most of Elvis's jewelry, but I liked it and hoped he would too. That night, Elvis called to once again invite me to help him choose coats for some relatives. I went to Graceland, and from there, for the first time, I got to ride in his Ferrari. The bodyguard Sam squeezed into the back seat with Elvis's cousin Billy and Billy's wife Jo. I sat in the passenger seat with Elvis at the wheel. Soon we were zooming along on the expressway toward downtown Memphis. Elvis drove at a speed I had never dared to drive. It was scary, yet exhilarating. I never doubted his ability to handle the car. We flew past a parked police car. Luckily, for some reason, the officer didn't pursue us. I wondered if he recognized Elvis's Ferrari. As fast as we were going, I doubt the police could have caught us anyway. Arriving downtown, Elvis wheeled into the parking lot of a store called King Furs and came to a quick stop. Relieved, I opened the door and got out, releasing the others from their confinement in the back seat. As Sam started to get out, he made a comical suction noise, pretending to remove his fingers from the tight grip he'd had on the back of my seat. I laughed, but I was sure he'd experienced that kind of ride with Elvis before. Inside the store, Elvis's attention went straight to a full-length white mink coat hanging on a rack in the back. He asked the salesperson to pull it out and wanted me to try it on. While his cousins and bodyguards stood around, I stepped in front of a three-way mirror and slipped into this incredible coat. In the reflection, I could see Elvis, now seated in a chair behind me, watching and looking quite pleased with a great big smile. The salesperson handed me a white mink hat, and when I lifted my hair to tuck up under it, Elvis jumped up and walked toward me. Putting his hand on the back of my neck, in a childlike voice, he said, "Now let me see that neck. Now that's a chicken neck." He was clearly getting a kick out of teasing me, and I had to laugh. Later he would tell me, "I'm self-conscious about my own neck. It's too thin. That's why my jumpsuits and shirts are designed with high collars." Elvis purchased the white mink coat and hat without bothering to look at anything else. On the way out the door, he told me they were mine. Astonished, I thanked him. It was clear he hadn't gone out tonight to shop for anyone else but me. He waved a hand. "I wish they'd had a full-length black one for me," he said. Had the salesperson heard him, I'm sure the clerk would have bent over backward to find one. The five of us returned to the car, where Elvis peeled out of the parking lot with me holding on for dear life, smiling at my new nickname, Chicken Neck. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Back at Graceland, Elvis went into the dressing area of his bathroom and returned with the 2 coats he had purchased the previous night. He asked me to take off the coat I was wearing, and, when I did, he put one of the coats around my shoulders, giving me a soft kiss on my neck. "These are yours, too," he said. I was dazed by the extravagance. What about his relatives? Was this his plan all along? I had never given any thought to owning a fur coat, and now I had several. No question about it. Elvis liked to do things big. He couldn't just give me 1 coat. He had to give me 3. "Thank you, Elvis. They're really beautiful," I said, simply, for what more could I say? This had been another one of his plans, and he was beaming. Caught up in the moment and obviously proud of what he had done, Elvis suddenly wanted me to call my family and invite them over to see what he'd given me. It was after midnight when I called home, but I knew that my family would be okay with late-night calls coming from Graceland. It was all part of this new adventure we were having with Elvis as our guide. I spoke with my mother and told her that Elvis had something he'd like to show the family. I knew they'd be curious, but only my mother and Rosemary were able to come over. Elvis asked me to lay all 3 coats out on his bed, and so I carefully arranged them on his bedspread. When Rosemary and my mom arrived, he invited them upstairs. Of course, they exclaimed over how beautiful the furs were. My mother was wowed because this was her very first look inside Graceland. Elvis graciously took her on a brief tour, while Rosemary and I waited in his bedroom. When they returned, we followed Elvis into his office, where he sang and played the organ for all of us. Not long afterward, a man walked into the room. I'd never seen him before. Elvis said hello, and the 2 of them disappeared into the dressing area of his bathroom. I wondered if he was talking business. For Elvis, the world was awake when everyone else was asleep, so I knew that was possible. Given the late hour, my mother and Rosemary told me they didn't want to overstay their welcome. They prepared to leave. Elvis reappeared before long, however, and my mother thanked him for inviting them over and said they should be going. We had all started walking downstairs when Elvis stopped midway on the staircase and said, "Oh, I almost forgot something." He opened his hand. In his palm glittered 2 diamond rings. "You won't find these in a Cracker Jack box," he teased, handing my mother and Rosemary each a ring. They stared at Elvis speechless for a moment. Then my mother shook her head. "Elvis, I'm sorry, but we can't," she began, but Elvis cut her off. "Mrs. Alden, I really want you and Rosemary to have these," he insisted. I had already learned that there was no force that could match Elvis when he was intent on being generous. My mother and sister finally realized that and graciously thanked him. I was touched by his gesture and wondered if the stranger who had arrived had brought the rings. I saw my mother and sister to the front door, then took Elvis's hand as we headed upstairs, thinking I'd never met another man so joyful and enthusiastic about sharing the bounty of his life with everyone around him. I eventually went home to get some sleep, but when I woke that afternoon, Elvis called and told me he wanted to get his dad a new car. Apparently his generous mood had lasted through the night. "Would you come with me to look for one?" "Of course," I said. I drove back to Graceland, and together we went to a local dealership. It didn't take long for Elvis to decide on a 4-door truck for his father. His kindness didn't stop there. Elvis also bought a new car for one of the dealership's employees before we left. As always, the combination of being able to surprise people and give them magnificent gifts never failed to put a smile on Elvis's face. He wanted to make people happy and wow them while doing it. Lisa flew to Memphis to spend the holidays at Graceland, where she divided her time between Elvis and playing with the children of Sandy Miller, Tish Henley, and Billy Smith. I was still a new person in her father's life, and she was a little quiet around me at first, but I felt confident we'd get to know each other better over time. Due to Elvis's nearly reversed sleep patterns, he allowed Lisa to stay up quite late, but he was a great dad. He especially loved tucking her into bed, often saying to me, "Let's go say goodnight to Lisa." On Christmas Eve, I was watching television with Elvis in his bedroom and left to use the restroom. The TV was off when I came back, and Elvis seemed absorbed in reading a book. As I walked around the foot of his bed, I noticed sparkling lights dancing all along the walls and ceiling. I looked toward the headboard and saw a beautiful diamond necklace with matching watch and bracelet propped up on my pillow. The bedside light had been turned its way and was aimed down to shine on the jewelry. I caught my breath. I had received so many incredible gifts already and wasn't expecting anything for Christmas. Elvis pretended to read for a few more seconds. Then he glanced up from his book and joked. I wish it had been designed for a man, because I would have bought it for myself. Taking the jewelry from my pillow, I leaned over to hug him. Once again, I wanted to tell him this was too much. However, now that we were closer, I understood Elvis would be hurt or even a little angry if someone turned down a gift from him, especially if the gift was something he'd put a lot of thought and effort into choosing and how he would present it. Still, I tried. This really isn't necessary, Elvis, I protested. You've already given me the coats, and I feel bad because I don't have your gift with me. I've been prepared to give it to him on Christmas Day. Before he could respond, Lisa came in. She sat on the bed in front of us, and Elvis turned the TV back on. Lisa began watching it with us. Elvis lovingly observed her for a moment, and then tapped me on the shoulder, motioning for me to watch Lisa as she periodically glanced about the room and back at the television, oblivious to the two of us. We have the same look in our eyes, Elvis said softly. I settled against the pillows, thinking it was touching that he saw himself in his daughter. The house was quiet early on Christmas morning. Lisa was still asleep, and because Elvis was going to bed, I told him I would go see my family, exchange gifts with them, and bring his present back with me later in the day. I also had a small silver bracelet to give Lisa. I visited with my family at home, then returned to Graceland. I expected to see Elvis as I usually did, relaxed and dressed in pajamas, with his hair a bit mussed. When I returned this time, however, he was sitting in his bedroom, dressed in nice clothes and with his hair styled. I sat beside him on the bed. "Merry Christmas," I said, and handed him his gift. As he unwrapped the necklace, I held my breath. Elvis took the cross out of the box, looked at me, and smiled. "I love it," he said, and all my fears disappeared. He then asked me to fasten it around his neck. Vernon and Sandy came over later that evening, and we met with them in the dressing area of Elvis's bathroom. I sat on the bed, surrounded by Elvis's clothing, while Elvis took a couple of nearby chairs and placed them across from me for his dad and Sandy. As the four of us were visiting, Lisa joined us, and I was able to give her my small gift, too. If any kind of traditional gift-giving ritual happened around the tree at Graceland, it must have happened before I got there, because Elvis seemed totally content to stay up in his bedroom and spend this part of Christmas Day with me. We watched television, talked, and visited with Lisa. After tucking Lisa into bed that night, Elvis and I went back into the bedroom, and I thanked him again for my beautiful gifts. "I like women in furs," Elvis said, and told me he'd once bought a child-sized mink coat for Lisa, but his ex-wife Priscilla didn't want her to wear it and returned it, thinking it was too extravagant for their daughter. Elvis's family didn't have much money when he was growing up, and I felt that was part of the reason he wanted to spoil Lisa and many of the other people he loved with such extravagance. However, I could definitely understand his ex-wife's point. What child needed a mink coat? On the other hand, how many children had Elvis as a father? Since Elvis seemed sensitive about the returned gift, I chose not to say anything. His impulse had been a generous one, and I didn't want to add to any hurt feelings. Chapter 13. Elvis's next tour was scheduled to start December 27th in Wichita, Kansas, and it would end on New Year's Eve in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was looking forward to it. Although I'd flown from San Francisco to Anaheim and into Las Vegas with Elvis, this would be my first time to really get the feel of being on the road with him. While I was home packing, Larry Geller had flown in and given Elvis more religious books. Elvis gave some copies to me when I returned to Graceland, and I was happy to be included. I had begun to enjoy our ritual of reading together and talking about the various ideas that we found intriguing in these books. I was also glad to find Elvis rested and ready to go. Vernon, Sandy, and Lisa were coming too, so I thought Elvis would be even more inspired to perform. While others rushed around, preparing for our departure, I remained upstairs with Elvis and Larry, looking over some of the new books. It was obvious from listening to the men talk that Elvis and Larry had been studying spiritual material for quite a while. Because of their extensive shared knowledge about religion and philosophy, I wasn't able to contribute much to the conversation. However, I definitely found the dialogue thought-provoking, even though I knew it would take me time, maybe years, to make sense of the different philosophies that fascinated Elvis. Later, I would see that Elvis wasn't simply on a spiritual quest, but striving to broaden his general knowledge as well. Many times on tour, he would ask someone to hold a dictionary and challenge him with words to spell or define. During Elvis's concert in Wichita, he sat behind the piano and played a beautiful song titled Unchained Melody. I'd never heard it before and loved it, feeling the song's lyrics about love and longing spoke to the deep, soulful connection between Elvis and me. Larry Geller told me later that it had been quite a while since he'd seen Elvis sit at the piano and perform the way he did that night. Despite the pace and demands of having to travel from one city to the next, on this tour, Elvis seemed free of the health problems that had plagued him in Las Vegas, and he was in a great mood. His voice was in fine shape as well, and his overall improved state was reflected in the quality of his performances. Other people noticed this as well. I happened to be standing beside Larry before one show, and he leaned over and said, "I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is, keep doing it." Hearing this certainly was an ego boost, but whether Elvis felt better because of our relationship or not, it was wonderful to see him doing well. I was also extremely happy to see that, during his shows, Elvis continued to wear the necklace I'd given him. Elvis seemed attuned to my presence even when he was busy performing. While he was on stage in Birmingham, Alabama, I was deeply touched when Elvis lowered his head toward the microphone and said, "I'm going to do this song for you, sweetheart," then sang, "The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face." Speaking to me directly in the middle of the song, he interjected, "Listen to me," and then, "You gotta listen to me." Elvis sang the song beautifully, and I was falling ever more deeply in love with him. Not everything went smoothly on that tour, though. Elvis was still worried about his father's health, especially on the road, and periodically made comments to me about it. Unfortunately, my attention was fractured by personal concerns of my own, after checking in with my family and learning that my grandfather was now experiencing complications due to pneumonia. We were in Atlanta, Georgia on December 30th. I tried to rest before Elvis's show that night, but I was having trouble sleeping and woke shortly after 2 p.m. I started thinking about my grandfather and tossed and turned while Elvis slept. Finally, I decided to place a call to my parents, who were at his nursing home, to see how my grandfather was doing. When my mother came on the line, I could tell she'd been crying. "Grandpa passed away about 10 minutes ago," she said. "I'm sorry, Mom," I managed around the lump in my throat as I heard the pain in her voice. Had my urge to call her been a premonition or merely a coincidence? My mother told me she'd just been discussing when to have the funeral with our relatives. "We were thinking of having it on January 3rd, she said. A wave of sorrow washed over me when I hung up. It was really impossible for me to sleep now, but I didn't want to disturb Elvis, so I lay quietly beside him. When he woke up, I told him the sad news. Very concerned, Elvis wanted to help in some way. He called my mother, gave her his condolences, and said, "I want your father to have the nicest casket possible." He even offered to pay his funeral expenses. My mother thanked him, but said my grandfather had set aside money to pay for his own funeral. Everything had been prearranged. Their conversation ended with Elvis assuring her I would be at the funeral. During Elvis's show that night, I couldn't shake my lingering sadness. I felt so sorry for my mom. I also felt terrible about not having been able to see my grandfather one more time to say goodbye. Elvis was in tune with my emotions. While we were flying into Pittsburgh for his next concert, he encouraged me to talk about my grandfather by asking me questions. I shared a few family memories and, to my surprise, found myself laughing with Elvis. I was glad. I knew that Elvis had a show coming up, and I didn't want my grief to affect his mood. I put on a brave front and was determined to keep a smile on my face. We stayed at the Hilton in Pittsburgh. The next evening, I was getting ready for Elvis's show when he called me into his room. 2 of his stage costumes were on his bed, one with multicolored blue stripes, and the other with the image of a black eagle on its front and back. "Which one do you think I should wear?" he asked. I was flattered. He'd never wanted my opinion about his stage outfits before. Since it was New Year's Eve and not an ordinary night, I pointed to the jumpsuit with the eagle, the symbol of America. Before we left, Elvis asked me to wear my full-length white mink coat and matching hat. I put them on, comforted not by the coat, but by the fact that Elvis had earlier lifted my spirits and was doing everything he could to show how much he cared about me. The atmosphere in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena was supercharged when we arrived. People were ready to celebrate New Year's Eve with Elvis, and their excitement buoyed my spirits. Chairs had been placed on one side of the stage for Lisa, Vernon, Sandy, and me, but Lisa chose to sit in my lap during the concert. I wrapped my arms around her, happy to have her close. Elvis's performance that night was energetic and nothing seemed to be hurting him. Soon after the concert started, he introduced his father, then Lisa. I helped Lisa stand so others could see her. As he eventually took a seat at the piano, Elvis said, "I want to dedicate this song to my daddy, Lisa, and Ginger." He proceeded to play Unchained Melody. As always, Elvis's voice and those haunting song lyrics touched my soul. It was a fantastic show. The evening was made even better when we returned to the Hilton and Elvis received a phone call from President Jimmy Carter, who wanted Elvis to serve as a special advisor to the youth of America. By the proud look on his face and the excitement in his voice, I could see how honored and touched Elvis felt by President Carter's request, and I was thrilled for him. Being on the road with Elvis was amazing. The experience made even more surreal because we were traveling from city to city and from hotel to hotel. Every morning I'd have to remind myself where I was when I woke up. On the way back to Memphis, Elvis told me he'd have a 6-week break from performing. He was coming down from the excitement of the tour, his mood even lower because Lisa was going back to her mother in Los Angeles. Still, once we'd returned to Graceland, I couldn't stay long either since I had to attend my grandfather's funeral. "Would you like me to go with you?" Elvis offered as I was leaving. I was astonished. Elvis had just finished a tour, and I knew he must be exhausted. "Aren't you tired?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'd like to be there." I felt very moved that Elvis would take time to support me. My plans had been to drive from Memphis to Arkansas with my siblings, but now I was stymied. If Elvis came, there wouldn't be enough room in the car. Maybe my brother should take his car too, but then there were his bodyguards. I had yet to see Elvis go somewhere without one. Once I was back at home, I phoned my parents relaying the news that Elvis would be coming to the funeral with me. My parents informed us that the weather in Arkansas wasn't good, and on January 2nd, the city of Memphis was walloped with a terrible snow and ice storm. I called Elvis. "I don't think we're going to make it to the funeral," I said, worried. "The weather's so bad." Elvis wouldn't let that faze him. "If I have to call the president," he said, "I'll see that you make it to your grandfather's funeral." "Elvis, how is this going to work?" I asked. He was silent for a minute, then said, "We're all going to fly in on the Jetstar. I'm sending someone to escort you to Graceland." It was close to midnight. I phoned my brother, telling him to bring his family over to my house. Before long, there was a knock at our door. I opened it, expecting to see one of Elvis's employees, but instead recognized the man standing on our front porch as our local sheriff, Gene Barksdale. The bright flashing lights of 5 police cars illuminated the night sky behind him. The sheriff introduced himself. "I'm here to take you and your family to Graceland," he said. This was our escort? Sheriff Barksdale stepped inside, along with several deputies, each man removing his hat as he crossed our threshold. I couldn't help smiling, thinking that Elvis was probably chuckling to himself right about now, as he imagined the shocked expression on the faces of me and my siblings. My family and I gathered a few belongings, entered the police cars, and slowly made our way to Graceland in a caravan. Elvis was waiting in the foyer with Charlie, Lamar, his stepbrothers, aides, bodyguards, and Joe. They were all prepared to go with us on the Jetstar. Having just come from a tour, I knew these men couldn't be too happy about this new travel plan, especially given the weather. Elvis told me that the runways at Memphis Aero were being de-iced, so we had to wait a little while. He invited the sheriff and his deputies inside for coffee. Right before the police left, Elvis presented Sheriff Barksdale with a gun from his personal collection. I introduced Elvis to my brother's daughters, Amber and Allison. As he looked over the huge group of people he'd assembled, Elvis realized there wouldn't be enough room for everyone on the Jetstar. He ended up chartering a Learjet out of Nashville to fly into Memphis for my brother, his family, and a few others. Before long, I was in the air with Elvis on his plane, along with my sisters and a few more from the entourage. Our flight was turbulent enough that some of the guys periodically voiced a concern. As we were flying into Harrison, Arkansas, the Jetstar approached the runway, but we didn't land because the conditions were too rough. Milo made a second attempt. Most of us were uptight, save Elvis, who calmly told everyone not to worry. Deep down, I didn't really think anything bad would happen either, because we were with him. During my time with Elvis, I had begun to believe he truly was special, and that God wasn't going to let anything happen to him. Due to ice and snow, the Jetstar skidded a bit when finally touching down, but we arrived safely. Milo came back from the cockpit and informed Elvis that he had told the pilot of my brother's plane to go 90 miles north into Springfield, Missouri because of the weather. Milo felt their plane wouldn't have the braking power the Jetstar did to land on this shorter runway. My parents were waiting for us as we exited the plane. "Mrs. Alden, I'm very sorry about your father," Elvis said warmly when he greeted my mother. She thanked him, and he then sent the Jetstar to Springfield to pick up my brother, his family, and the others. Rental cars were waiting for everyone. We followed my parents to a Ramada Inn, where they were staying with some other relatives. Elvis had reserved a few rooms for the rest of us. My siblings and I gathered with my parents in their room. I visited with them for a while and then joined Elvis in his room. Elvis had brought books in his jeweled robe with him. Now he put on the robe and sat on the bed, where we read together, talked, and rested for a few hours. The service, scheduled for 10 a.m., would take place in a small community called Mount Sherman, 25 miles away. I knew this relatively early morning start time would throw Elvis off his usual schedule, and hoped it wouldn't prove too difficult for him. When Elvis ordered breakfast, I became increasingly concerned about our timing. It was almost time for us to get ready to leave for the service, and Elvis didn't seem to be in any hurry. Al Strada eventually brought our food. Elvis turned on the TV, and the two of us began eating. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Al opened it, and my mother was standing outside. "The state police have made an extra effort to make the road to the funeral more passable," she said. Then, noticing Elvis in his robe and our breakfast in front of us, she gently reminded us of the time and said it was quite a drive to the service. This was enough to nudge Elvis into fast gear. We finished eating, and as various members of his entourage began checking in with him, I left so he could get ready. It was cold outside. I put on my long white mink coat, then joined my family, waiting for Elvis. Before long, he stepped out of his room with a few books in his hand, wearing a dark, high-collared coat and blue scarf around his neck. My parents had driven their Lincoln Continental to Harrison. Now they offered it to Elvis, telling him they would take one of the rental cars. "That's fine," Elvis said. Charlie, David, and Ricky took the back seat of the Lincoln while Elvis and I sat up front. With Joe behind the wheel, we pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the Mount Sherman Assembly of God Church. The weather conditions were still treacherous. The ride was slow along the two-lane ice and snow-covered road, and grew worse as we entered Newton County, where the area became hilly and the road more winding. We finally reached the small town of Jasper, turned onto another narrow road, and began our ascent up the snow-covered mountain toward the church. The road looked so slippery that I couldn't help voicing my concerns about being able to make it up to the church. "If I can land my jet on that icy runway, I can also land on top of that mountain," Elvis assured me. 5 slick, nail-biting miles later, we finally pulled into the small gravel parking lot of the country church. My grandfather had donated the land for this church, helped build it, and preached in it, too. Organ music was softly playing when we walked inside. Although we were 15 minutes late, the minister had waited for us before starting the service. It was a small church with only 6 pews on each side. We quietly took seats in the back. The Reverend Maddox stepped forward and began singing, "How Great Thou Art." There was a hint of nervousness in his voice, until suddenly Elvis began singing along, and then Charlie joined in. I was initially surprised that Elvis would sing, but he did it softly, not trying to take over the service, and the Reverend's voice grew in power as Elvis subtly nodded his head at him. The Reverend Martin Valines and the Reverend Guy Jones, both friends of my grandfather, handled the rest of the service, with the Reverend Valines giving the eulogy. Near the end, Elvis leaned my way and, with his eyes fixed on my grandfather's casket, said under his breath, "Son, you're on your own." It was a line I remembered from the film Blazing Saddles. I wondered if he was trying to make me laugh. At times Elvis dealt with tension by injecting humor, and in a strange way, hearing him say this did lighten my mood for a moment. When the service ended, we stepped outside the church. Everyone was very courteous and polite. One of my cousins began speaking with Elvis as cars began to line up behind the hearse. Elvis continued talking with her, which prompted my mother to mention that it was time for us to go. Before returning to our car, Elvis quickly mentioned to my mother, "Mrs. Alden, you know, this church reminds me of the church I went to when I was a little boy." We then drove the 2 miles to the cemetery for a short graveside service. After it was over, Elvis once again was kind and gracious with everyone, taking time to speak with a few relatives and telling one of my cousins that the weather reminded him of his days in the service in Germany. We returned to the Ramada Inn, where we gathered our belongings, and Elvis changed back into his jeweled robe. My parents were going to drive the Continental back to Memphis, but Elvis asked my mother if she'd like to fly back with me and my sisters. My mother accepted the invitation when my father said he didn't mind driving because it was only a 6-hour trip home and someone had to bring the car back. My brother decided to accompany him. Once we were back in Memphis, the Jetstar would return for my sister-in-law, nieces, and the others. Elvis had my mother ride with us on the way to the airport and took a seat across from her when we boarded the plane. During the flight, the two of them began conversing about various things. I heard him tell her at one point that his favorite cousin, Bobby Jane, had died around the same time as my grandfather. I was startled by this revelation. Had Elvis chosen to go to my grandfather's funeral instead of his own cousin's? He'd never said a thing about it to me. My mother's siblings and I told him how sorry we were. Elvis also mentioned that he'd like to take a vacation to his home in Palm Springs, California, and invited my mother, sisters, and me. I was thrilled. It would be wonderful to see him in a relaxed atmosphere after his hectic schedule. Unfortunately, my mother had to work, and Terry couldn't come, but Rosemary was between jobs. I'd love to go, she said, and I was glad she and Elvis would have a chance to get to know each other better. I thanked Elvis once we were alone again at Graceland. His tremendous act of kindness in attending my grandfather's funeral, especially given all of the effort it had entailed, would forever hold a special place in my heart. Chapter 14. True to his word, Elvis immediately planned our getaway to Palm Springs for January 4th. This left little time for Rosemary and me to pack. Somehow we managed to get together our clothes and return to Graceland for the trip. I had imagined we'd be flying to Palm Springs on the Jetstar, perhaps with an aide or two and a bodyguard along for the ride. However, when we arrived at the airport with Elvis, I saw the Lisa Marie ready to go. Charlie, Lamar, Joe, David, and his wife, Angie, Ricky, Al, and a few others were waiting for us on the plane. I couldn't believe Elvis traveled with this many people on vacation. Then again, I reminded myself, Elvis always did things his own unique way, and grand gestures seemed to be the norm with him. He also seemed determined to surround himself with people, bringing a little bit of home with him on the road. It was Rosemary's first time on the Lisa Marie, and Elvis gave her the grand tour. This would also be her first trip to California. Rosemary was more audacious and outspoken than Terry or I. She didn't seem the least bit intimidated by either new experience. I also quickly learned that if anyone could match wits with Elvis and Charlie, it was Rosemary. When Charlie appeared with drink and cigarette in hand, firing off jokes, Rosemary kept up with him joke for joke. I loved having her with us and watching her cut up with them. Rosemary really knew how to make Elvis laugh, and it made me happy to see him so relaxed and comfortable with my big sister. We landed at the Palm Springs airport near dawn. The glitz of Las Vegas was nowhere in sight, only the serene desert with spectacular mountains in the distance. We exited the plane and the group divided, most going on to a hotel, while Elvis, one of his aides, Charlie, Rosemary, and I rode to Elvis's home on Chino Canyon Drive. I loved the house. It was a low, sprawling, Spanish-style white stucco home, with a roof tiled in a warm terracotta color. The property was surrounded by a black iron fence. "Not much yard," Rosemary said as she noted the lack of grass. Elvis laughed. "That's why I had some of the rocks painted green." Excited to show us the house, Elvis led us down a hallway to the right. We passed a front bedroom and stopped outside a smaller room with a couch and bar inside. Elvis turned to Rosemary. "Which room do you want?" Rosemary glanced at Charlie. Then, looking pointedly at the room with the bar and sofa, she said, "Charlie, this one's yours." We entered the master bedroom at the end of the hall. Like the one on the Lisa Marie, this one was decorated in blue, apparently one of Elvis's favorite colors. Elvis then led us back toward the entryway and into a living room with a fireplace and large windows. Continuing through the room, Elvis took us outside to a free-form pool surrounded by a patio. Viewing the calm landscape with its backdrop of mountains, Elvis put his arm around me. As we stood there together for a few moments, quietly absorbing the serenity around us, I was deeply content. Back inside, Elvis led us to a den with couches, pinball machines, and a television. When Rosemary and I both complimented the bright, multicolored carpeting, Elvis laughed and said, "The carpet was a gift from the Mafia." Was he joking? Like everyone, I'd heard stories that the Mafia controlled a lot of what went on in Las Vegas, but I didn't really know anything about that. Still, it made sense to me that Elvis might have at least met some members of the Mafia, because everyone, from fans to fellow entertainers, sought out Elvis's company, if only to be seen with him. It certainly wasn't out of the realm of possibilities that someone in the Mafia had given Elvis the carpet as a gift to impress him. On the other hand, I'd never overheard any conversations or seen Elvis involved in any activity that would lead me to believe he was actively involved in the Mafia in any way, and I never would. Elvis had brought his books to Palm Springs. I'd brought mine too, and I'd adopted his habit of making notes in the margins and underlining text that I found interesting or wanted to understand better. I still never felt my beliefs as a Christian were being tested, only that Elvis was trying to introduce me to different ways of thinking and exploring different ways of looking at the universe. Eager to have Rosemary share what we were reading and discovering, Elvis invited her to join us in the bedroom and gave her a few books as well. The three of us read for a little while, but Rosemary wasn't used to Elvis's sleep patterns and returned to her room before too long to rest. Even on vacation, Elvis needed some help going to sleep. A little while after Rosemary left us, an aide brought in what I assumed was a sleep packet. I decided it had to have been pre-filled back in Memphis, since no doctor or nurse was staying with us here in the Palm Springs house. That afternoon, Elvis and I were awake but still sitting in bed when there was a knock on our door. It was Rosemary. She came in saying, "Elvis, your lock just got taken." Rosemary told us that she'd been awakened by female voices outside shouting, "Elvis!" She'd looked out her window and had seen women gathered by the driveway gate removing what looked like a large unlocked padlock from it. I couldn't believe Elvis's fans already knew he was here, or that they'd be that daring. It wasn't clear to me if any bodyguards had arrived at the house yet, but Elvis didn't seem worried. He thanked Rosemary and shrugged off the incident as if he'd encountered similar acts many times before. I actually thought it was kind of funny at the time and didn't feel Elvis's safety was really at any risk. From watching Elvis perform on stage, I had seen firsthand how much his fans wanted a piece of him, a scarf, a ring, and so on. With Elvis's singular celebrity, which he had been experiencing for over 20 years, I knew that he was used to this kind of behavior from people. He understood it was just a way for his fans to try getting closer to him because they loved him that much. Most of the time, he seemed to accept their attention as a compliment rather than any real threat to his safety. Just as they had at Graceland, the members of Elvis's entourage congregated in Palm Springs. Elvis's stepbrothers and Al alternated between staying at the Palm Springs house with us and in a hotel, catering to Elvis's needs. I rarely saw the bodyguards. I was unsure where they were staying, but when they were at the house, I suspected they gathered in the den. I knew what Charlie and Joe did for Elvis, but I couldn't figure out Lamar's role. The few times I'd been around him, he was plain-spoken and direct, and Elvis usually bounced jokes off of him. Finally, I asked Elvis, "What does Lamar do for you?" "I don't know," he said. "Remind me to ask him later." Sure enough, when Lamar came to say hello the next time, Elvis looked at me with a grin, then back at Lamar. "Lamar, remind me to ask you something." Looking perplexed, Lamar said, "Okay." I smiled at Elvis, feeling I had the answer to my question. It seemed Elvis liked Lamar for entertainment purposes, and was just generous in including Lamar whenever he went places. I wouldn't get to know these men much better during our time here, as they continued to mainly speak with Elvis when stopping by our room to greet him. However, during that time, I did get to know some of the comical nicknames Elvis gave a few of his employees and friends. He sometimes called Charlie Hodge Slewfoot. Lamar Fike was Lardass because of his weight. In private, Elvis told me he called his aide Al the Atheist, and that his bodyguard Dick had the personality of a rhinoceros. Despite his generosity and habit of joking around with these men, the black humor of these nicknames made me wonder if he was completely happy with some of them. For instance, one evening, Rosemary rushed into the bedroom to announce that she'd been sitting in the living room when David's wife Angie came running in, looking terrified with David in close pursuit. David had been carrying what Rosemary recognized as a dog training stick. Lamar was in the room too, Rosemary said, and Angie was trying to hide behind him. Apparently David and Lamar had exchanged strong words. Rosemary was also worried because there were some guns lying out in the open close by on a table. She was afraid someone might really get hurt. "I want David in here now," Elvis said, and yelled for David to come into the room. Clearly angry, Elvis asked us to step outside while he talked to David. I went to Rosemary's room with her. A little while later, Elvis called us back in, looking embarrassed and shaking his head. He said he couldn't understand Ricky, Billy, or David sometimes because they're on different wavelengths. Occasionally I would see that the guys weren't all that pleased with Elvis either. Even though Elvis, Rosemary, and I were relaxing, it was still work as usual for them, and a little resentment would show itself from time to time. When Elvis was hungry, for instance, he would usually ask me to tell one of the aides what he wanted. One time, when Al was on duty, I saw him seated in another room and gave him Elvis's order. Al rolled his eyes, stood up, and walked into the kitchen without saying a word to me. Al's reaction surprised me. Was it because it was me asking him to do something, or because he was mad at Elvis for some reason? Or was he just tired of his job? I remembered the time Al had come to my house and told my family that he wasn't overly happy with his job at Graceland and worked mostly to support his mother. Rosemary had a similar experience once, when she walked into the kitchen and heard Al and Ricky lightly bickering over which one had to reheat Elvis's food. Neither one wanted to do it. Elvis often wanted his meals reheated, typically after getting caught up in conversations and letting his food get cold. It didn't seem to be a difficult job, but I guess for some of them, it was trying their patience. Just as he did at Graceland, Elvis chose to relax by staying inside and reading or watching television, rather than going anywhere, hanging out by the pool, or socializing. It would have been nice to leave the house, even just to take a ride around and tour the area. But I understood that Elvis had to be tired after his tour, and then going straight on to my grandfather's funeral. Besides, for Elvis, going out in public was never an easy task, as the padlock incident had proved to me yet again. Everyone wanted to get close to Elvis. The only exception to this was our trip to see Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, who had a home nearby in Palm Springs. One afternoon, Elvis told me that the Colonel's wife, Marie, was very ill and he wanted to visit her. We arrived at the Colonel's home, and as I followed Elvis to the front door, I noticed a number of statues of elephants in all different sizes. "Why do you have so many elephants?" I asked when the Colonel stepped outside to greet us. "An elephant never forgets," he said. Then smiling, he added, "I want Elvis to buy me a ring with an elephant on it." I couldn't tell whether he was joking or not, but decided he must be. The Colonel and Elvis began to chat. As we walked around the side of his home, he showed me his backyard. Carousel horses, sitting atop poles, rose from the shrubbery surrounding a pool. We followed the Colonel inside, where Elvis told me he would be right back. He and the Colonel left me while they visited with Marie in another room. I wondered how long Marie had been ill and thought how nice it was of Elvis to see her. They returned a short time later, and Elvis said goodbye without lingering to socialize. I didn't know the details of their long history at that time. From our visit, I couldn't tell if he and Colonel Parker were close. So far, their relationship seemed to be mostly centered around business. I accepted his choice not to socialize much with Colonel Parker and some of the others along with us, and didn't push Elvis to do otherwise, figuring when he felt ready, he would do so. It was just nice being with him in a different environment, and it was great having Rosemary with us as well. As I became closer to Elvis, getting to know him way beyond the image of the superstar, there still were constant little reminders of who he was. On January 6th, Rosemary and I were in Elvis's room with him when he got a phone call from Colonel Parker. After listening for a few minutes, Elvis hung up, looking stricken. "Frank Sinatra's mother just careened off a mountaintop," he said. Dolly Sinatra, 82 years old, was one of 4 people killed when their Learjet took off from Palm Springs and crashed into the San Gorgonio Mountains. She was heading to Las Vegas to see her son's opening show at Caesar's Palace. Elvis was using dark humor in the face of tragedy, but I could tell the accident upset him. When he mentioned wanting to offer one of his planes to Frank Sinatra, it struck me that, among entertainers at this level, there must be a certain camaraderie. Elvis felt comfortable offering help to Frank Sinatra, in the same way I would offer to help if something happened to one of my friends or neighbors. Elvis spent a lot of time flying in his own planes, both large and small, and his father had flown in on one to see his Las Vegas shows. Private planes carrying celebrities had gone down several times over the past 20 years. Although I never thought anything would happen to Elvis, I found myself wondering if this was something that ever worried him. I thought back to my grandfather's funeral and felt thankful once again that we'd made it safely. While his plane travel didn't cause me great worry, I was concerned about his health. When it came to meal times, Elvis and I enjoyed eating similar things such as hamburgers, steak, and omelets, but I continued to notice certain foods were being brought to Elvis in larger than normal portions. Sometimes Elvis was seduced by the temptations of these larger portions, and sometimes he wasn't. I hoped to move us toward a healthier diet, but I just didn't know how because he was used to getting what he wanted. Elvis did like yogurt, though, and sometimes asked for some, which I encouraged. I wasn't a nutrition expert, but thought yogurt would be good for him. I hoped to find other foods like this that I thought would be more beneficial for him to eat as well. One afternoon I entered Elvis's bedroom and found him talking on the phone. As I crossed the room, he looked up at me and said into the receiver, "Tell her how to take care of me," then held the phone out to me. "It's Priscilla." I took the receiver, confused, as Elvis sat by watching. "Hello?" I said. A female voice instructed, "See that he eats right and gets plenty of rest." "Okay," I said, quickly handing the phone back to Elvis and wondering if that was as awkward for Priscilla as it had been for me. But I did think it would be nice to have allies when it came to helping Elvis with his diet, even if one just might be his ex-wife. Elvis continued his conversation, and I went into the bathroom to give him some privacy. I wondered how often he spoke to Priscilla. I'd been unaware of what their relationship was like, but now I reminded myself that Elvis and Priscilla were raising Lisa together. It was only natural that they talk once in a while. Having left the door slightly ajar, I heard Elvis say, "Really, Priscilla, Ginger's one of the prettiest girls I've seen in a long time." I suddenly felt 10 feet tall, hearing him compliment me. But then I had to ask myself why he was telling Priscilla this. Did he want the women in his life, past and present, to be jealous of one another? Shortly, I heard Elvis hang up the phone. I returned to sit on the bed with him. To my surprise, he opened up a little about his relationship with Priscilla without me even prompting him. "I'll always love Priscilla because she's the mother of my child," he said, "but I let her go. What hurt me was that her boyfriend, Mike Stone, said that I couldn't see Lisa." I saw the wounded look on his face and could only imagine how that had felt, knowing how much he loved his daughter. I took his hand. It meant a lot that Elvis would share this intimate detail of his life with me, and I was glad that he was talking about his emotions so openly. I hoped he'd always feel this comfortable sharing himself with me. Throughout our entire stay in Palm Springs, the flow of people in and out of the house continued nonstop. Typically, the visitors would include Lamar, Joe, Elvis's stepbrothers, various girlfriends and wives, bodyguards, and a few unfamiliar women. But no matter who was at the house, Elvis seemed more interested in the new books his hairdresser had given him than he was in socializing with any of his employees or guests. He wanted to spend his time reading with me in the bedroom and asked only Rosemary to join us. Elvis had the charisma and persuasive ability to draw you into his activities, and Rosemary was soon getting excited about the books, too, saying she liked the mystery of the spiritual philosophies we were studying. I wondered how often, or even if, any of the others among Elvis's family and friends ever read with him. I had yet to hear anyone other than Larry mention the books or get drawn into discussions about the philosophical and religious ideas that interested Elvis. One of his favorite books was Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, the story of Yogananda's lifelong exploration of the mysteries of the saints and yogis. Elvis seemed fascinated by Yogananda. He was also reading Only Love by Sri Dayamata, which dealt with Yogananda's teachings, and The Road Ahead by Swami Kriyananda, a book that illuminated Yogananda's world prophecies. Elvis also admired David Anria's book Through the Eyes of the Masters, which expounded on the belief that a person could incarnate in another person's body. Over time, Elvis would tell me he thought Kuthumi, one of the masters from the book, was incarnating himself, and pointed out a photo with the master dressed in a high-collared jacket similar to his own favorite style at the time. Elvis felt there was some force inside him, guiding him to teach and bring joy to others in various ways, especially through music. He was reading these books not only to understand his own life, but to help others as well. Having witnessed some mystical things with Elvis already, and there would be more of those events ahead, I was beginning to wonder if the kinds of miracles we were reading about were possible. I wasn't ruling anything out. Elvis's endless fascination with Eastern philosophers led him to believe that we in the West could only benefit from studying their teachings. India has the spiritual, and we have the natural resources, he explained. They have to meet at some point. When I looked over Elvis's books with him, he often asked if I understood what we were reading. Sensing his deep need for me to be in sync with him, I usually told him I did. I wanted to, and always tried my best, hoping in time that I would achieve as deep an understanding of these subjects as Elvis did. Elvis took special care to explain his intellectual and spiritual interests to me. He had studied chakras, and at one point he showed us a book on them. I learned that the word chakra came from the Sanskrit language and meant wheel center. A chakra channeled life force, feelings, memories, and thoughts. The kundalini, or life force, was like a spiritual energy residing in a resting body, Elvis said. A sleeping serpent in the root chakra located at the base of the spine. To demonstrate this, Elvis placed his hand at the bottom of my spine, forcefully applying pressure while explaining that, if this spiritual energy was aroused and released, its power was enormous and could bring one to an enlightened state. Shaking his head from side to side as if saying, "Man, oh man, if I could only do this." He told me it took a lot of time and training to learn how to release that energy. Elvis also eagerly taught me about acupressure, which he explained could help relieve tension. Taking hold of my foot, he pressed his fingers on different pressure points, showing me how each had an effect on the rest of the body. Elvis had strong hands, and it hurt a few times, but overall, I found it really relaxing. More and more, I was finding his beliefs persuasive. Elvis was awakening my own curiosity as he introduced me to these different concepts. During one of our reading sessions, Rosemary began to feel nauseous, which led Elvis to try healing on her. He asked Charlie to join us, and the four of us went into her room. Rosemary lay down on her bed. Charlie held her hand, and Elvis hovered his own palm close above her abdomen. Staring intensely at his hand, Elvis said to Rosemary, "Think of the color green for healing." He waited for a couple of moments, then quickly lifted his hand high in the air, shaking it, seemingly trying to cast away her ailment. Watching him brought me back to my own experience in Las Vegas. I realized I was almost holding my breath, willing Elvis's healing to work on my sister. I wanted her to feel better and truly wanted to believe in this alternative healing technique. I also wanted things to go well because it was so important to Elvis. In any case, it worked. After a few moments, Rosemary said, "I feel better now," and got up. Elvis began talking about the power of concentration then, and asked Rosemary and me to follow him out to the backyard. The sun was coming up as we walked past the pool and over to a nearby shrub. Placing one of his hands near the leaves, Elvis watched them and waited for some subtle movement. I didn't see anything happen. After a short time, Elvis turned his attention toward the sky. Raising his arms and turning his palms upward, he began focusing on some clouds overhead. A few moments passed, then the clouds parted a little. Elvis looked back at Rosemary and me with a subtle smile. "That's wild," Rosemary said. Welcome to Elvis's world, I thought. I was starting to feel that maybe Elvis was right. Maybe we all really did possess abilities we're not cognizant of. Maybe if we trained and learned to focus, we could more fully tap into the power of our minds. Who was I to say no to that? The way Elvis viewed life and his place in it led me to believe that he thought he had developed a keener awareness of his own spirituality and of the unseen layers of living than most people. I don't think Elvis thought of himself as godlike. However, from his insatiable curiosity and intense studies of different religious practices and philosophies, it was clear he felt he had achieved a higher consciousness, one that gave him unique insights and an enlightened view of the powers we all might possess if we were willing to follow his path. Even today, many years later, I still think the opportunity is open to all of us, but it would take much time and study, which is not usually available to the average individual who faces a normal workday and raising a family. Elvis's mind was always churning. He was either orchestrating events or trying to understand them. I remember one afternoon, Elvis was dressed, as he usually was, in his pajamas, and began pacing back and forth in front of me, circling his bedroom. "What do you notice about my walk?" he asked. I watched him carefully for a few seconds, trying to find something out of the ordinary. I didn't see a thing. "One leg is shorter than the other?" I joked. Again, Elvis was being surprisingly serious. He pointed out that his walk was very cat-like, and let me know his animal title in karate was Mr. Tiger. "I fight the way a tiger does, light on my feet," he explained. I had seen for myself how Elvis had interwoven karate into his shows. Now it occurred to me that Elvis literally prowled from one side of the stage to the other so his audiences could see him. I wondered if his iconic pacing might have somehow been developed while learning karate. The deliberate way Elvis was demonstrating his stride at that moment made me think that even this simple act of walking was something he was acutely aware of. With Elvis, every detail mattered. He also loved to talk about the people he knew or events in the news, especially when something mysterious had happened. While we were in Palm Springs, at one point Elvis became animated when talking to Rosemary about Claudine Longet, the ex-wife of singer Andy Williams. Claudine had gone to jail briefly earlier that same year for the shooting death of her boyfriend, a skier known as Spider Savage. Claudine claimed it was an accident, but Elvis thought there was more to it. He didn't stop at pure speculation either. Elvis actually phoned a friend, a private investigator named John O'Grady, and had Rosemary listen on a separate phone line while they discussed different theories concerning the case. Elvis also loved to postulate about possible foul play in the death of Bruce Lee, the martial arts expert. Given Elvis's passion for karate, I wasn't surprised that he was fascinated by Lee's death, and by some supposedly special techniques one could employ while fighting. For instance, Elvis told me about the possibility of generating an invisible wall of resistance out of projected energy, a protective shield with a special characteristic. It could soak up the energy of an attacking foe and repel it back on itself. Only a few people knew how to execute this, Elvis said excitedly, and called Charlie into the bedroom for a demonstration. Elvis stood up and put his hands out in front of him, focusing intensely as if controlling some kind of energy. Then, after taking a few deep breaths, he asked Charlie to run at him. Charlie backed up and came charging full force at Elvis, only to fall smack back down onto the floor, as if he had run into an invisible wall. I started to laugh, thinking they must have done this to entertain me, but both men seemed deadly serious. I quickly stifled my laughter and was left feeling bewildered. Had Elvis really learned some special mind trick in karate that allowed him to create an invisible force field? I had my doubts about this particular demonstration that day, but seeing how serious Elvis was about it, I began to think that certain inexplicable things might actually be possible. Welcome to Elvis's world, I thought again. One simply had to be there to understand. Chapter 15. Elvis kept the curtains closed in his Palm Springs bedroom, helping to blur any difference between night and day. My days were no longer dictated by the rise and fall of the sun, but by when Elvis went to sleep and woke up. Elvis, Rosemary, and I had been so completely immersed in various books and our discussions that each day had melded into the next. The calendar was completely forgotten. It wasn't until we woke one afternoon and an aide wished Elvis a happy birthday that I realized it was January 8th. Elvis was 42 that day, and I felt terrible that Rosemary and I hadn't been able to buy him anything. We eventually got dressed and went into the living room, where members of his entourage and a couple of unfamiliar women were waiting to greet him with birthday wishes. Elvis chose to spend the evening visiting with everyone, occasionally reading to them passages from some of his spiritual books. Later that night, Elvis announced that he was going to have Robinson Department Store reopen for all the ladies. He wanted to send us on a little shopping spree. It felt odd to be leaving Elvis on his birthday, but I thought maybe Elvis just wanted to be alone with the men. Elvis provided spending money for each of us, giving Rosemary and me a little extra. We headed out, accompanied by a bodyguard. Once inside Robinson's, I found a purse I liked, then set off to find a gift for Elvis. I browsed the aisles, but Elvis wasn't the kind of man you buy a tie or a pair of cufflinks for off an ordinary store shelf or rack. Nothing caught my eye, so I decided I would use the rest of the money to get Elvis a gift back in Memphis. I didn't know what that would be yet, but I hoped to find something different. We eventually returned to the house, where the rest of his birthday was low-key, and spent doing one of the things Elvis loved most, reading to me, Rosemary, and a few others. The next afternoon, Elvis, Rosemary, and I started watching the Gong Show on television. It was an amateur talent contest, and the three of us were having fun, laughing at some of the show's contestants and their often absurd talent, when Joe Esposito came into Elvis's bedroom, walked over to Elvis, and whispered something in his ear. "That's okay, you can say it in front of Ginger and Rosemary," Elvis said. Looking slightly uncomfortable, Joe repeated, "Linda called and was wondering if you're going to pay the rent on her apartment in Los Angeles." I was completely taken aback. Elvis had been paying Linda's rent? Why? And for how long? Elvis was watching me closely, as he did sometimes, studying my face for a reaction, but I tried not to let my surprise and concern show. Elvis looked at Joe and shook his head. No. Looking back at me, he said, "It's not fair to you." Joe walked away. "Well, Elvis, it wouldn't be right," I said, remembering that Elvis had asked me to commit myself 100% to him, and feeling like he should do the same for me. Elvis kept his eyes on my face. "I bought Linda a house not long ago to put some distance between us," he said. Had Linda lived at Graceland full-time until then? I wondered, but I didn't ask. I was too busy trying to absorb this new twist. Elvis then looked at Rosemary. "How can I get her to stop calling?" he asked. Rosemary shrugged. "Change your number, maybe?" He grinned, but I was unable to smile. I continued to ponder all of this and what it meant for Elvis and me. When Elvis had told me in Las Vegas that he and Linda were just friends, I had believed him. After all, he'd been publicly dating other women, and that seemed to say his relationship with Linda must be over. However, I was sure the articles of clothing and toiletries inside Graceland had been Linda's. Plus, she had called before, asking to spend Christmas with him. It seemed that Linda was trying to hang on, no matter what Elvis did. Now I took comfort in the fact that, even though Elvis had been helping Linda out by paying her rent, he'd just said in front of Rosemary and Joe that he wouldn't do it anymore, and he certainly wasn't trying to hide the fact that Linda had called. I chose to trust that Elvis was being honest with me about the relationship being completely over for him. Unfortunately, I would still feel uncomfortable every time I saw Sam, Elvis's bodyguard, and Linda's brother. Sam and I were friendly with one another, but I couldn't help wondering how he truly felt toward Elvis, and toward me. Elvis spent a great deal of time trying to understand numbers, customs, signs, theories, and how the universe's patterns were interrelated. He even liked to dissect names. Sometimes he'd put his glasses on upside down and say our names backward, calling himself Sylvie and me Regneg. And when I told Elvis my middle name was Lita, he seemed pleased to note that Ginger Lita Alden and Gladys Love Smith, his mother's name, contained the exact same number of letters in them. It was illuminating to talk about philosophy and numerology with Elvis, but it could be tiring. One morning, after having been up all night with Elvis, Rosemary and I simply couldn't focus anymore. We began to miss words, skip sentences, yawn, and joke around. I thought Elvis had to be tired, too, but instead of appearing to need sleep as much as we did, he told us that we had just given up and didn't want to continue reading with him. "Elvis, I can't keep my eyes open," I said, feeling bad but wanting to be completely honest. "We're just tired." It wasn't easy to reason with Elvis when he had his mind set on something. Now, determined to continue his studies, Elvis said, "I'll get someone else who will read with me then." He called for Charlie to come to his bedroom while Rosemary went off to her own room. Charlie entered, looking as exhausted as I felt, and sat on the foot of our bed. Elvis began reading to him. Unable to keep my eyes open even a second longer, I lay back against the pillows and dozed off. I woke as Charlie got up to leave. When Elvis finally went to sleep, I hoped he understood I was trying my best to be there for him. Elvis could be just as compulsive about eating certain foods as he was about studying his books. Early the next morning, I noticed that, between visits from some of the guys, Elvis must have eaten at least 8 containers of yogurt over a short period of time. We finally went to sleep, but Elvis woke up shortly and decided he wanted more yogurt. He asked me to get it or have someone bring it to him. His request concerned me. I had yet to see Elvis do any exercise at all during the weeks we'd spent together, except when he was on stage. Now, after spending so many hours with him nonstop in Palm Springs, I was concerned about him overeating. I was just trying to look out for his health. "I don't think you need any more yogurt," I said. Elvis went back to sleep without pressing the issue. So did I, thinking all was well. A short time later, a deafening bang echoed throughout the room. I bolted upright and saw Elvis standing at the foot of the bed, holding a .57 Magnum pistol in his hand. I risked a glance behind me and saw a bullet hole in the wall above the headboard. My heart was going a mile a minute. I looked back at Elvis, trying to wrap my mind around the idea that he really had just shot a hole in the wall. By way of explanation, Elvis said he had asked for yogurt again, and I hadn't responded. "It was an attention-getter," he said. Bewildered, I told him I was asleep and didn't hear him. Meanwhile, around us, the house was silent. Nobody else appeared to have heard the gun go off, or if they did, they weren't coming to see who'd been shooting what. Extremely hurt, I began to cry and ran into Rosemary's room, almost bumping into her as I shut the door. She'd been coming out to see if I was all right, her eyes wide with fear. She looked as scared as I felt. "What happened?" Rosemary asked. "I was just on my way to your room." I was having trouble catching my breath. My pulse was still roaring in my ears as I told her about the gun and the inexplicable reason Elvis had given me for firing it. Rosemary's reaction was immediate. "My God, we're leaving right now," she said. I couldn't move, and I was still having trouble breathing. My mind flooded with questions. Why had Elvis shot a gun in our bedroom? Had his sleep medication momentarily caused him to lose touch with reality? I couldn't come up with any rational explanation for Elvis's behavior. Rosemary decided to go see where Elvis was and stepped into the hallway. After a few seconds, she returned and closed the door. I looked out the window and saw Elvis standing alone by the pool, she reported. I didn't know quite what to do or how to feel as Rosemary and I sat in her room, unsure of what might happen next. Now that I felt a little calmer, deep down, I didn't really think we were in any danger. Before long, there was a knock at the door. When Rosemary opened it, Elvis was standing in the doorway, dressed in his robe and wearing his glasses, a deep look of remorse on his face. I was seated in a chair beside the dresser. Elvis stepped inside and sat down in the chair on the opposite side of the dresser. The three of us were silent for a few moments. Then Elvis stood up, took one of my hands and one of Rosemary's, and led us to the bed. The three of us sat down. Continuing to hold our hands, Elvis bowed his head and closed his eyes. "God, don't let us lose it," he prayed aloud. "God bless my family and Ginger's family, and please don't let us break up." Obviously, he was concerned about the lasting effect this incident could have on us. I could offer him little comfort, though. I was still in shock and extremely hurt by what he had done. I had completely shut down emotionally. I was numb. Fortunately, Rosemary seemed to understand what I was feeling and took over. "Elvis, you can't do this kind of thing," she said. Grasping for common ground, trying to play peacemaker between us, she started talking to Elvis about some of my likes, such as motorcycles and horses. "You should do some of those things together," she ventured. Elvis listened silently, still holding our hands. Was he absorbing this? Finally, I dared to speak. "I was only trying to help you," I said, quietly, almost under my breath. Elvis looked down at the floor, took off his glasses, and held them between his fingers. Silence hung over the three of us for a few moments. Taking my hand again, he said, "I'm sorry, Ginger." I sensed on a deep level that Elvis honestly was sorry. It felt like our relationship had been put to some bizarre kind of test, and all for the sake of more yogurt. I was acutely aware that my feelings for Elvis were like none I'd ever felt before. I'd been completely consumed by him, and now I had reached a point in my life where I couldn't picture my future without him. I loved Elvis. Did I think he would intentionally harm me? No. Did I think Elvis was used to getting what he wanted? Yes. Some ironic little voice inside my head observed that one good outcome of this whole scenario was that Elvis didn't get to have any more yogurt. I forgave Elvis that day, but I suspected more challenges lay ahead. I went to sleep, still grappling to understand this very complex man, and hoping that he might now understand me a little better, too. Late the following night, Elvis decided with his usual combination of impulsive action and determination that we both needed to have our teeth checked. He flew in Max Shapiro, a dentist from Los Angeles, to make a house call. Dr. Shapiro was in his 60s and brought his fiancée, Susan, a woman in her 20s, to Palm Springs with him. When they arrived, I thought, wow, this woman is a lot younger than the dentist, then caught myself. Probably a lot of people seeing me with Elvis thought the same thing about us, I realized, but it just seemed different with us. Maybe this had to do with how Elvis looked and acted. He could be like a big kid sometimes. The only times I was actually aware of our age difference was when we were reading together and he was teaching me something. Elvis sat in a chair in his bedroom and Dr. Shapiro examined his teeth. When Dr. Shapiro finished looking at Elvis, I took a seat. The dentist said he could lightly file a few of my lower teeth if I wanted, just to even them out a little. I was fine with that and tilted my head back in the chair. As Dr. Shapiro worked on my teeth, he mentioned that he'd been thinking about getting married, but he and Susan didn't know where the right place would be. Do you have a marriage certificate? Elvis asked. Yes, we always carry it with us, Dr. Shapiro said. Why don't you get married here? Elvis suggested. Dr. Shapiro stopped working on my teeth and I sat up. The dentist was obviously caught off guard, but he loved the idea, and so did Susan. Elvis was euphoric. He immediately began making plans, telling us that Larry Geller could legally perform marriage ceremonies. He called Larry and asked him to come to Palm Springs, then quickly had an aide summon a jeweler to the house so Dr. Shapiro and Susan could choose their wedding rings. When the jeweler arrived, he displayed various pieces of jewelry in front of Elvis on the bed. Dr. Shapiro and Susan chose some rings. Like a kid in a candy store, Elvis began pulling the price tags from a few rings, picking out rings for me, Rosemary, himself, and a couple of other people, with seemingly no regard for the cost. This whole time, Elvis and I were still in our sleepwear. When Larry arrived, Elvis didn't bother to change, so I didn't either. Dressed in our pajamas and robes, Elvis and I went into Charlie's room for the ceremony. Rosemary, Charlie, and David joined us there. With Elvis acting as best man and me as maid of honor, the wedding got underway with Larry officiating. Elvis was beaming as Dr. Shapiro and Susan began reciting vows they had previously written for one another. During the ceremony, I noticed some movement from David. As he stood beside Rosemary, he turned and looked at her suddenly with a big grin on his face, trying to hold in laughter. I could see that the marriage ceremony was affecting David slightly differently from the rest of us. Unable to contain himself any longer, David got down on all fours and began slowly crawling out of the room. Lucky for David, Elvis was so happy and excited about being able to make this wedding happen that he didn't notice. I would have hated to have anything spoil the moment for Elvis. Dr. Shapiro and Susan thanked everyone when the ceremony was over. This was such a kind-hearted thing for Elvis to do, and it was wonderful to be a witness. I was also impressed and amazed he'd been able to pull everything together so quickly and easily. Surprisingly, the groom wanted to finish working on my teeth a little more afterward, so I returned to the bedroom with Dr. Shapiro and resumed my position in the chair. After he and Susan left, Elvis asked Larry and Rosemary to come into the bedroom. Clearly still energized by the wedding, Elvis discussed the ceremony. He loved the idea of saying verses to one another. He picked up the prophet and read again from its passages on marriage. At one point, he stopped reading to look over at me. Ginger, if you and I were to get married, would you consider having Larry marry us? He asked. I was blown away. Wow, I thought, he's bringing up marriage again. This was the first time he'd mentioned it since Las Vegas. I knew he and Larry were friends, and Larry looked happy about the idea. Sure, I said. I was excited. Elated, Elvis continued going over his spiritual books. The four of us talked well into the early morning hours. That night, all of the excitement about the wedding and our feelings about marriage continued to swirl around us. Elvis had once again reconfirmed wanting to marry me. Hearing him talk like this made me feel the two of us drawing ever closer to creating a future together. Chapter 16. After spending a little over a week in Palm Springs, Elvis decided it was time to return to Memphis. We all packed up and headed for the airport. As we entered the Lisa Marie, The pilot was having a problem with the engine, and the interior lights weren't working. Rosemary and I followed Elvis toward the back of the darkened plane, where the three of us sat down at the conference table. The lights suddenly came on, and Elvis looked at Rosemary, shocked. He had mistakenly taken hold of her hand in the dark. Quickly letting go of it, he said, "Good God, Ginger, where are you?" He grabbed my hand, and the three of us laughed. Elvis, Rosemary, and I moved into the bedroom, and after a little while, the plane took off safely. Once in the air, Elvis said to me, "You need your own room and a private phone line." Surprised, I realized I must have mentioned to him at some point that I shared a room with Terry. I was amazed that he remembered this. Elvis wasn't done pondering my living situation, apparently, because then he said, "I don't like it that you have to drive so far to see me. I'd like you to have a home closer to Graceland." I stared at him in disbelief, touched that he wanted me to live closer to him, but stunned by what I thought he might be proposing. Was Elvis really thinking what I thought he was thinking? Elvis knew that I lived with my family, so I didn't think he was suggesting that I leave them to buy a home closer to Graceland for me to live in alone. This must mean that he was talking about a new home for my entire family. This idea was so over the top that I found it difficult to digest. My parents had just purchased our home. It was modest, certainly compared to Graceland, but we didn't really need a new house, and I didn't think of the one we had as being too far away from Graceland. However, I was extremely flattered that he was thinking about how to make my life more comfortable. Luckily, Elvis quickly moved on to another topic, so I didn't have time to protest or give him any sort of answer immediately. He did that sometimes, I noticed, enthusiastically flitting from one idea to the next as he bared his thoughts to me. Sometimes it almost seemed like he just wanted me to share what was going through his mind, minute by minute, as a way of letting me know him. I saw signs that Elvis had a growing concern about my safety. This was part of his protective nature with me. He knew I usually drove around alone, so upon our return to Memphis, he gave me a Smith & Wesson .22-32 kit gun. He told me to keep it in my car when traveling back and forth to Graceland. This gift didn't surprise me, as I had learned that Elvis loved to collect guns, and he owned a great many of them. He enjoyed showing them to me on occasion. Among the guns he brought out were a Derringer with a mother-of-pearl handle, various magnums, an ivory-handled revolver, and even a machine gun. I thought the guns were really amazing, and especially liked the small pearl-handled Derringer. I readily agreed to keep the gun in my car. My father kept a revolver and a rifle in our home for protection, but I had never been taught how to use a gun. I wasn't afraid to have one, though, and it did make me feel more secure. What Elvis was appreciating, and I was not yet aware of, was that my world had changed. I was now in his world, where you needed bodyguards, as people could come at you in unexpected ways. A perfect example of Elvis's protective instinct would happen months later when I noticed a strange car parked in front of our house with a man inside. He sat there for a long time, and I wondered if it was a reporter or photographer. Elvis happened to call at the time, and I innocently mentioned that a reporter might be outside my home. "I'm coming over, and I will smash his goddamn lens out," Elvis fumed. Before I could say another word, the phone went silent, and I became worried about a possible confrontation. Luckily, the car left, but not long before Elvis's Ferrari came flying around the corner of our street. All was okay that day, and Elvis simply ended up visiting and taking my sister Terry for an exhilarating ride in his Ferrari. Now that I was home, I was able to go shopping for Elvis's birthday present. Elvis had once told me he used to own a monkey named Scatter, so I bought something fun to remind him of that favorite pet, a statue of a monkey holding a candle. I also purchased a large mirror with the outline of Elvis's face etched on the front. In honor of his love for the way Peter Sellers, as Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther films, said the famous line from Casablanca, I wrote, "Here's looking at you, kid," on a card and taped it to the front of the mirror. Elvis was tickled by the gifts. He placed the monkey on a shelf in his bedroom and propped the mirror against the wall. They would remain in those places throughout the rest of his life. Elvis continued to keep his custom of mainly living upstairs at Graceland, but I was glad to see that he seemed mostly free of stress. We continued enjoying our evenings reading and watching television together. We happened to see an episode of Saturday Night Live in which the comic Andy Kaufman appeared as a guest and did his impression of Elvis. Peering over the top of his reading glasses, Elvis addressed Andy on the television screen. "You better get it right, son," he said. We laughed and had fun rooting for him. In the end, Elvis thought Andy did an all-right job and told me, "You know, impression is the highest form of flattery." If I wasn't at Graceland, Elvis and I usually spoke on the phone twice a day, usually right before falling asleep and again upon waking. I had grown more comfortable with calling him, but most of the time I still waited for his call, not wanting to wake him. Shyly, I also began to say, "I love you" to Elvis on the phone. My family and I loved one another, of course, but we rarely expressed that verbally, so this was a big step for me. However, if I didn't tell Elvis I loved him first, he usually asked me if I did. During my visits to Graceland, I was finally becoming a little better acquainted with Elvis's extended family and friends. Some of their roles still confused me, though. I didn't sense that his cousin Billy Smith was on the payroll or had a particular line of work. He just seemed to be on hand to do things for and with Elvis whenever Elvis wanted him to. Billy was the son of Travis, the guard at Graceland who my father once had been friendly with many years back. Travis had since passed away. On one of Billy's visits upstairs, he told me that before Elvis had met me, he and Elvis had been out riding motorcycles once, and after returning home, Elvis laid across his bed and said, "There must be someone out there for me." This made me feel good, thinking that maybe I was this person Elvis had been waiting for. I had certainly come to feel we were meant to be together. On occasion, Billy's wife Jo came to Graceland with him. She had dark eyes, pale skin, and pitch black hair. She was usually dressed in black, and Elvis teased her by calling Jo his assassin. Sometimes the two of them would kid around and cut sharp glances at one another, as if each knew what the other one was thinking. As Billy's wife, Jo had been a part of Elvis's life for a long time. She and I were always friendly with one another, but we didn't have any time alone together to become good friends. George Klein visited every once in a while, and he was always nice. On occasion, Vernon made appearances. He maintained an office in a building behind Graceland, along with Patsy Gamble. If he and Elvis needed to go over business or some private matter, sometimes they'd ask me to leave the room, then summon me back afterward. I respected their privacy and never minded this. During one of these visits, Elvis asked his dad, "Doesn't Ginger look a little like Mama when she was young?" Mr. Presley thought a moment. "Yes," he replied. I smiled back shyly, regarding this again as a compliment. Elvis smiled right back at me, as if satisfied that what he had told me on the plane was confirmed by his father. We continued to meditate together alone in the bedroom, and sometimes while Elvis read, I would rest my head against his chest, feeling safe, and gently stroke the side of his face with my hand. I loved those peaceful moments. Every once in a while, before stepping into his bathroom, Elvis would announce, "I'm going to meditate and clear my mind." He had also said this in Las Vegas a few times before disappearing into the bathroom and closing the door. It seemed that Elvis occasionally needed a retreat, to just be on his own. For him, this sanctuary seemed to be his bathroom suite. One day, we were casually sitting together in Elvis's room and chatting, when out of the blue, Elvis asked, "Would you like to move in?" This was completely unexpected, and I was more than flattered. I knew this was an offer that many women around the world would jump at. But as much as I had come to love Elvis and think of him as part of my life and my future, to just move into Graceland without being married first was something I didn't believe in or feel was appropriate to do at the time. Although this was 1977 and cohabitation was becoming more acceptable, I came from a pretty conservative background. My sisters and I had been brought up to believe that you lived with someone only after you were married. I may have been behind the times in that way, but even being on the road with Elvis was a daring thing to do for me, and I didn't take these actions casually. Hoping he would understand, I looked him in the eye and nervously said, "Elvis, it just isn't my way." Fortunately, Elvis seemed okay with that. He smiled and said, "Fine, I respect you for that." Late on the afternoon of January 18, just a week or so after returning from Palm Springs, Rosemary and I decided to see a movie near Graceland. I briefly considered asking Elvis to join us, then dismissed the idea as impractical. From my parents' description of their movie-watching experience with Elvis back in the 1960s, I knew Elvis usually rented a whole theater if he wanted to see a film undisturbed, without drawing the attention of fans. Besides, I hadn't heard from him yet that day, so I figured he was still asleep. As Rosemary and I were leaving for the movie, I asked my mother to tell Elvis where I was if he should call. We were getting out of our car at the theater when Steve Smith, one of Elvis's aides, intercepted us and said Elvis wanted us to skip the movie and go shopping for my family. This was something I didn't quite understand. For a moment, I wondered if Elvis had done this because he didn't want me to see a movie on my own. But why would Elvis feel that way? I looked at Rosemary. I didn't want to abandon my plan with her. This really put me on the spot, and I didn't know what to do. Elvis had made another of his grand gestures, and I appreciated that he was thinking of my family. However, he really didn't need to buy them anything else. Now Steve was standing in front of me, expecting me to go with him. Do I tell him, "No thanks, we're going to the movies"? I had a strong feeling that Elvis would be offended by that. I turned to my sister. Do you mind if we see the movie another time? I asked. Rosemary shrugged. It's okay, she replied. The two of us then followed Steve to Goldsmith's department store. Once inside, Steve told us that Elvis wanted us to buy mink coats for our family and for ourselves. Me too? Elvis had already given me beautiful coats. However, knowing Elvis as I did by now, I felt certain that if I didn't select something as he'd requested, he would only bring me back to the store. I picked out coats for my mother, Terry, and my sister-in-law, then chose a simple black mink for myself. Rosemary found a less expensive fox fur coat she liked, but since it wasn't a mink, she asked Steve if it would be okay. Steve called Elvis from a phone inside the store, then relayed to Rosemary that Elvis had said, "Only minks." She put the fox coat back and selected a mink. We followed Steve to Graceland and carried the coats upstairs, where Elvis was in his pajamas and seated on his bed. We laid the coats in front of him. He looked over our purchases approvingly. As if Elvis hadn't already been generous enough, though, he said, "There isn't one for your father or brother." I thought he was going to take us back to a store, but Elvis walked over to a closet by his bathroom and began browsing through it. Pulling out a sheepskin coat and a long brown mink, he laid them among the others. Then he stepped into his loose blue jumpsuit, pulling it up over his pajamas, and secured his black studded belt around his waist. Finally, he put on a pair of shiny black boots and tucked his Magnum 57 inside the belt. "Let's go to your house," Elvis said. I quickly phoned home to tell my parents we were on our way to see them. An aide gathered the coats and piled them into the studs. Elvis slid behind the wheel, and Rosemary and I climbed inside the car. We left Graceland with bodyguards following in a separate car. Driving down a two-lane country road near our home, Elvis told us he had noticed another car following ours for quite a while. With no streetlights, it was pitch black out. I supposed he'd seen the headlights behind the bodyguard's car. Elvis suddenly pulled over to the side of the road. I looked back nervously and saw the headlights from the bodyguard's car. Sure enough, another car was behind that one. Both cars pulled over behind ours. Before the bodyguards could exit their car, Elvis jumped out of ours and began walking briskly toward the car in question. Worried for his safety, Rosemary and I turned around and tried to see what was happening through the back window of the Stutz. In the headlights, I saw the figure of a man walking toward Elvis. The bodyguard stepped between them. When the stranger innocently showed them a pen and paper, Elvis politely gave the man his autograph and returned to our car. As he eased into the driver's seat, Rosemary asked him, "Aren't you afraid to do that?" Elvis pointed to the gun inside his belt. "Why do you think I carry this?" At my home, Elvis surprised my family with their new coats. They stood in our den, quite stunned, and almost in unison said, "Elvis, you shouldn't have done this." A look of complete contentment suddenly graced his face. "I wanted to," he said. Pleased by their reactions, Elvis was in an upbeat mood and later asked Terry to play something on the baby grand piano in our music room. She chose a classical piece, Toccata, by Aram Khachaturian, which she had performed in the Miss America pageant. We gathered around the piano, and Elvis stood beside Terry, carefully watching her hands on the keyboard. I was glad Elvis was now getting to see the musical side of my family. Toccata wasn't the easiest piano solo to play, and Elvis applauded when Terry finished, telling her that he thought she was extremely talented. He then sat beside her on the piano bench and began playing and singing Unchained Melody. To see Elvis having a good time at our home warmed my heart. His love of music and his enjoyment of family were all the more evident during moments like these. I longed to share many more days like this with him. The next evening, Elvis called to see if Terry, Rosemary, and I would like to spend the night at Graceland. Terry was out with her boyfriend, but Rosemary said she'd love to come. Although I had driven to Graceland many times before, this time Elvis said he was worried about me driving after dark, so he sent someone to pick us up. Since our time together in Palm Springs, Elvis and Rosemary had enjoyed kidding around with one another. I tended to be more reserved, but both of them had a wicked sense of humor. That night, the three of us were sitting in Elvis's bedroom, watching television, when Elvis jokingly made an off-color remark. Rosemary brightened. "Could you imagine if you acted like that in some of your movies?" she quipped. Elvis laughed. Rosemary then suggested the opening sequence for a new film, one that would be nothing like most of his all-American apple pie musicals. "It opens on the gates of Graceland," she began, "with peaceful music playing in the background and birds chirping. Faintly in the distance you hear the roar of a car engine getting closer and closer, and suddenly your Ferrari comes smashing through the closed front gates. You get out with a cigar in your mouth and walk inside. The maids are all cowering. Going upstairs, you find Ginger chained to a wall saying, 'Elvis, don't hit me anymore.'" Elvis thought the idea of him playing a bad guy on film was hysterical. The three of us joked around, putting different twists on the story. changing the ending of the movie each time to make it and Elvis's character more outlandish. We just sat around talking and laughing, and when Elvis heard Rosemary wasn't dating anyone steadily, he asked, "If you could go out with anyone, who would you like to go out with?" "Well, I like Burt Reynolds," Rosemary said. Elvis winked at her and said, "That can be arranged, you know." My sister, a woman of many words, was suddenly speechless. We continued clowning around for a while. Then Elvis put on a tape of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and after we'd finished watching it, Elvis told Rosemary she could sleep on the bed in his dressing area. When we woke that afternoon, Elvis decided to drive Rosemary and me home. We left Graceland with his aide, Steve. As we pulled into our driveway, Elvis noticed some dust on my Cadillac. "You shouldn't let it get dirty," he said. It was only a little dust, but I didn't want Elvis to think that I wasn't appreciative of my gift or a person who wouldn't take care of it. So after that, a couple of times when I thought the car looked slightly dusty, I washed it in our driveway before going to Graceland. At home, we visited with my parents in the den, where at Elvis's request, my mother brought out her large family Bible again. Elvis pointed out a few new things he had discovered. He dissected the word Genesis, saying genes is, and jotted down some notes. He also underlined verses and shared his thoughts with us on the meaning behind them. When we started getting hungry, Elvis sent Steve to get some food for everyone from McDonald's while he continued talking with my family. After a little while, he wanted to play the piano, so we all moved into our music room. Our kitchen table wasn't large enough to accommodate everyone, so when Steve returned, my mother brought some plates into the den. Elvis and I sat beside my parents on the sofa. While we were eating, Elvis said he'd like us all to live closer to Graceland. This was the first time I'd heard him mention the idea since our flight from Palm Springs. "I'm worried about Ginger driving back and forth to see me," Elvis said, "and I'd like her to have her own room and phone." Still addressing my parents, Elvis added, "As you get older, you don't need the burden of a house note hanging over your heads. You should be able to retire, play golf, or do whatever you want. I'd like you to look for a house close to Graceland." My parents clearly didn't know what to say to this offer, but they politely thanked him. Despite Elvis's enthusiasm for buying them a house, I think the idea didn't seem real to them. They had worked their whole lives to own a modest home. They hadn't been living in Elvis's world where you could buy mink coats, new cars, or 3 rings on a whim. In addition, the friction in my parents' marriage hadn't improved. This affected my siblings and me, naturally, since they'd been going through difficult times for quite a while. However, I kept this to myself, not wanting to violate my parents' privacy, and hoping that things between them might somehow improve. It was getting late, and Elvis said he would like to stay over at our home. The fact that he felt comfortable enough to want to do this meant a great deal to me, but I knew my family had to be panicking, thinking as I was. Where would he sleep? There was a king-size bed in the room Terry and I shared, but my mother had been busy decorating the rest of the house and had yet to buy curtains for the bedroom window. She had pinned a large sheet to the wall in order to cover the window. Luckily, Rosemary jumped in, offering Elvis her room. She asked if he'd like to see it. He stood up, and Rosemary and I walked him down our hallway. Rosemary's room was decorated in tune with the 1970s. She had affixed crackled mirror squares to one wall, and her bed's headboard and a dresser, both dark wood, had detailed sections covered in red velveteen. She'd chosen red for her curtains and bedspread, too, and a swag lamp in the corner glowed a soft red. Looking at Rosemary, Elvis said, "Your room looks like a brothel," then said he was kidding. He didn't mind that, but Rosemary's bed looked too short. His feet would probably hang off, he said. Next, noticing her television in the corner, Elvis asked what kind it was. Rosemary walked into the room and turned it on. "It's a good one." It was a black and white television set. When Elvis saw that, he said, "You need a color one." Despite our embarrassment about the sheet covering our bedroom window, Terry said she would stay with Rosemary and Elvis could sleep in our room. It was the only choice. My father soon went off to bed, but Rosemary, Terry, my mother, and I stayed up talking and reading with Elvis in the den. Later, the doorbell rang. I looked out our front window and saw Al standing on our porch. To my surprise, he was holding a brand-new color television set. Now I put the pieces together. Steve had earlier made a call from our house, and Elvis must have arranged for this then. Al carried the TV into Rosemary's room, took the old one, and left. Rosemary thanked Elvis, expressing her utter disbelief. I smiled, knowing exactly what my sister was feeling. As everyone grew tired, my mother brought out a blanket for Steve, who said he'd sleep in the recliner. My mother said goodnight to us, and when she left the room, I knew she felt as I did, that she could trust Elvis as a gentleman, and that I would never engage in anything inappropriate under my parents' roof. Rosemary and Terry headed to Rosemary's room, and Elvis and I went into mine. I had been alone with Elvis many times before. Still, it felt awkward sleeping with Elvis in my bedroom at home. When we got up that afternoon, Elvis said he had a recording session in Nashville and wanted me to go. I dressed and gathered some clothes. Before leaving home, Elvis told my family it was the first time he had spent the night in someone else's home in a while. "I feel like I have a family because you're as nutty as I am, and I feel no jealousy here," he said. I wondered if Elvis felt there was some jealousy at Graceland, either directed at him or between members of his family and staff. I would never fully know what he meant, nor would I ever ask. I was just glad that my house was a place where he felt comfortable. We flew into Nashville and settled into our hotel. I stayed in my bedroom, while Elvis went into the living room area of our suite and began lightly rehearsing with a few others. I heard someone strumming a guitar. Elvis began to sing, and then everything fell quiet suddenly. Shortly after that, Elvis came walking into my bedroom, rubbing his throat. He told me it was beginning to feel sore. I felt sorry for him, knowing how concerned he always was about losing his voice. I wasn't aware of anything that was going on behind the scenes. I didn't know what he was supposed to be recording, how important it was, or who was waiting on him, and Elvis hadn't told me, but that was okay. I knew the quality of his singing mattered to Elvis in every song. That's just who he was. He talked with his staff. A doctor came to see him, and we spent the next couple of days reading and watching television together in his room, hoping his throat would feel better. At various times, Elvis told me that he didn't want to record if his voice wasn't perfect. Finally, he said he was afraid to continue and ended up canceling the session. We flew back to Memphis. With 3 weeks off before touring again, I hoped he'd have time to recuperate fully before his next round of performances. Chapter 17. Back at Graceland, Elvis stayed upstairs, as usual, and tried to be extra protective of his voice. Instead of reading to me as he often did, he let me take over and read to him over the next few days so he could rest. Others still came and went, visiting with Elvis upstairs as they usually did, but now Elvis made a point of speaking softly, taking extra measures to care for his throat. Before long, luckily, Elvis was feeling and sounding much like his usual self. The rings Elvis had given me in Las Vegas were a tad large on my fingers, and Elvis had noticed that I'd been wearing tape wrapped around the bands to hold them on. One evening, he told me that he wanted to know my correct ring size, and mentioned that he'd asked a local jeweler to come over and measure me. Before long, the jeweler walked into Elvis's bedroom and introduced himself as Lowell Hayes. Lowell measured my finger, he and Elvis shared a friendly visit, and before long, Lowell left. A short time later, I went into the bathroom. When I returned to Elvis's bedroom, I discovered that he'd propped a magnificent necklace with the letters TLC all in diamonds on my pillow. Once again, he'd aimed the overhead reading light on it to make sure it sparkled. I was blown away. I had noticed these tender, loving care necklaces worn by women in his family, female band members, and a girlfriend or two of certain entourage members. This one was unique, though. It looked larger than the others and the only one I'd seen made with all diamonds. I was deeply moved by this beautiful, singular expression of Elvis's affection. He fastened the necklace around my neck, telling me, "I had this made especially for you, Ginger." Having this necklace meant that I'd been truly accepted as a part of Elvis's inner circle. Although I had felt this sentiment from him for a long time, I was happy now to have something that would signal this message to the people around us. Turning back to him, I told him how much I loved it and thanked him. Elvis smiled and winked. "I don't give these out to just anyone," he said. I continued to spend a lot of time at Graceland, but one afternoon, my niece Amber asked me to take her to a local hamburger restaurant, and I suddenly realized that I had been so focused on Elvis that I had neglected seeing my friends or hanging out with my family. Wanting to spend some time with Amber, I happily picked her up and we went to the restaurant. As we were finishing eating at a back table, I noticed a woman at a nearby table stand up and fold a newspaper she'd been reading. I glanced at the front page of her paper when she walked by and was startled to see a picture of someone who looked remarkably like me. I hurriedly paid our bill and raced out of the restaurant with Amber. We headed straight to a nearby store. There, lined up on magazine racks beside every cashier stand, was the National Enquirer with a large black and white photo of Elvis and me, captured on tour, gracing its cover. I was shocked. Me on the cover of a national paper? Tabloid or not, I was awestruck and thought it was a nice picture of the two of us, too. I purchased a copy and rushed home to show it to my family, figuring they'd get a kick out of seeing me on the cover with Elvis. Because I had devoted most of my free time to seeing Elvis, I'd barely gone out much on my own, Naively, I had thought that any picture snapped of Elvis and me on tour or in a car coming from and going to Graceland were just being taken by Elvis's fans. Being in the media spotlight was something new to me, especially because we honestly hadn't been out that much in public yet. I soon realized I was now of interest to the press. One day, I was at home and planning to take a drive with my family when I noticed a strange car parked on the street in front of our home with the engine running. A man was sitting inside it. Who was this? Was this a photographer or a reporter? Just in case, my sisters and I donned sunglasses before walking to the car to make it more difficult for someone to tell who was who. Sure enough, the car followed us. My dad randomly drove around for a while, but eventually had to stop and get gas. The car that had been following us pulled up at the gas station too, and the driver got out. He approached our car and peered into the back seat. "Which one is Ginger?" he asked. Determined to protect my privacy, my sisters and I pointed at one another. The man walked away, not looking too happy. I was glad he couldn't hear my heart thudding against my rib cage. I knew we wouldn't be able to keep this up for long, though, as the word was definitely out. I was with Elvis. On the night of January 26th, I was watching television with Elvis in Lisa's bedroom. He left the room at one point and was gone for long enough that I looked to see where he was. I found Elvis talking on the phone in his bedroom. I returned to Lisa's room and watched some more television, then heard a commotion as others came and went upstairs, speaking in private with Elvis. It wasn't like him to avoid me. As more time passed, I started to feel odd and began worrying that something might be wrong. When Elvis finally returned to Lisa's room, he took my hand, without saying a word, and led me into his dressing area. I was all the more puzzled as he guided me toward a black chair in front of his bathroom window, where Elvis asked me to sit down. As soon as I was seated, he knelt before me with one hand behind his back. "Ginger, I've been searching for love so long," Elvis said, "and never in my wildest dreams did I ever think I could find it in my own backyard. I've been 60% happy and 40% happy, but never 100%. I've loved before, but I've never been in love. Ginger, I'm asking you, will you marry me?" Elvis brought his hand out from around his back, and it was a small green velvet box. Nearly overcome by emotion, my voice quavered. I was glad I was sitting down because I wasn't sure my shaking legs could have supported me. "Yes," I managed, holding on to the beautiful words he'd just spoken. Elvis placed the box in my hand, which was now trembling. Inside it was the most magnificent ring I had ever seen, with a huge center diamond surrounded by 6 smaller ones. I kissed Elvis, feeling my eyes brim with tears. He delicately took the ring from the box and slipped it onto the ring finger of my left hand. It was a perfect fit. Now I remembered the jeweler, Lowell, Elvis had called to the house to measure my finger. I realized he must have planned this then. With a hint of nervousness in his voice, Elvis asked me to hold up my hand so he could see what the ring looked like. Commenting on how beautiful it was, he said, "God will come through and tell me when the time is right for our wedding. Are you ready? Can you cope with my lifestyle?" "Yes," I answered, still naive, but ready to do whatever that entailed. "There will be a lot of people jealous of you," Elvis went on. "But you should always be a lady, and if negative things are ever said, just bow out gracefully." "I will," I said, clueless, at that bright moment in our lives, as to just how deep and biting those jealousies would become. I was also unaware of how close some of the people around Elvis were to the other women in his past, and how loyal they would remain to those women. I only knew that I loved Elvis, and hoped his feelings for me were as deep as what I felt for him. I was willing to wait to marry until the time felt right to Elvis, and intended to leave it all up to him. But for now, having a ring on my finger made me realize that he was as deeply committed to our relationship as I was. We were going to build a future together, and I was never happier. When we walked out of his bathroom, I was surprised to see Charlie and Billy Smith standing in Elvis's bedroom. I blushed, knowing they must have been in on the secret and were waiting for us to come out and tell them our news. Beaming, Elvis said to me, "Show them the ring." I was proud to, and in such a daze, my hand almost rose on its own. Elvis took hold of it and shook his head. "Boy, oh boy," he said. Charlie and Billy hugged and congratulated us. Then Charlie presented us with a small backgammon set and said, "This is a little engagement gift." This was so sweet of him, and I hugged him again. Shortly afterward, Elvis's stepbrothers, Ricky and David, entered the room to give us their hugs and congratulations as well. Everyone knew. The overwhelmingly cheerful response was comforting, but I wondered if these men would ever really accept me as Mrs. Presley, or if they felt that Elvis getting married might bring some change in the dynamics of their relationships with Elvis. Every few minutes, Elvis would tell me to hold up my hand so everyone could see the ring. I think I was still in a state of shock because each time he did this, I had trouble keeping my hand from trembling. After everyone had finally left us alone, Elvis and I sat on the bed. He asked me to raise my hand several more times so he could look at the ring again. "It looks like a car headlight," Elvis said proudly at one point. "I think it's beautiful," I countered, leaning over to kiss him. I was so overwhelmed, I couldn't take my eyes off the ring. At first I was dying to call my family and let them know, but then decided it would be fun to do it in person. Elvis wanted others in the house to see the ring and know we were engaged. He called for Aunt Delta and the maids to come up. With each new arrival, he proudly again asked me to hold out my hand, even aiming the overhead reading lights so the ring gleamed and sparkled, giving them a better look. Each one enthusiastically congratulated us. It wasn't until after Elvis's death that I would learn the center diamond in my engagement ring was the diamond from his custom-made TCB ring, which Elvis always wore on stage. The jeweler, Lowell Hayes, had made it for him, and years later he described on his website how this engagement ring came to be. Elvis had called him at 1 o'clock one morning, telling him that he wanted Lowell to make an engagement ring for me, with a diamond that looked like the one in the middle of Elvis's TCB ring. Lowell protested, saying he didn't have a diamond like that, but Elvis called him back half an hour later and said he had to have the ring that very night and pleaded with him to make it. Lowell reported that he'd called diamond dealers in New York then, but they all reported that nobody could get a diamond of that size on such short notice, since the diamonds were kept in vaults overnight. Once Lowell had delivered the bad news to Elvis, though, he had pondered the problem some more and realized they could use the diamond from Elvis's TCB ring and find another to replace it later. Elvis was thrilled with that idea. Lowell had driven to Graceland to collect the ring and went back to the jewelry shop to remove the diamond and make a mounting for it. He centered the TCB diamond and added 3 diamonds on either side of it, then drove back to Graceland to present the ring to Elvis, all on the same night. When I heard this story, I was once again reminded that the rules in Elvis's world were a lot different from the rules governing everyone else. It had been an extraordinarily unforgettable night. By the end of it, I had come to believe with certainty that all of the things Elvis had been saying to me about us being soulmates and us having a future together were absolutely true. I was committed to Elvis, heart and soul. The following afternoon, I woke, eager to share my news with my family, but there were a few more people to announce it to at Graceland first. Elvis and I went downstairs to show the ring to his grandmother. Dodger was sitting in bed when we entered her room. When Elvis told her we were engaged, she took my hand in hers, smiled sweetly at Elvis, and said she was happy for us. Elvis was still as excited as he'd been the night before. Now he wanted to show his father the ring. I followed him out the back door. I hadn't seen that much of Vernon at Graceland. He usually spoke to Elvis by phone, and I felt nervous about his reaction to our news. He was a nice man, but from the little I'd been around him, I knew Vernon could be blunt. I was slightly intimidated by him. What if he didn't like the idea of me being Elvis's second wife? For whatever reasons, mostly due to the chilly weather, the fact that we'd been touring, and Elvis's preference for his bedroom, I had never actually been in the backyard of Graceland before, though I hadn't really thought about that until now. We walked through a pasture behind a racquetball court, and I saw some horses in the distance before entering Vernon's property through a gate in the fence surrounding his backyard. Elvis had built a 2-story white house with black trim for his father on Dolan Drive, which ran along one side of the land surrounding Graceland. After Elvis showed Vernon the ring, his father embraced us both and congratulated us. I immediately felt relieved. I didn't sense that Vernon was really surprised, though, which made me wonder if Elvis had spoken to him at some point about giving me a ring. As he had earlier with me, Elvis told his father that God would tell him when the time was right to set the date. We visited for a bit. Before long, however, Elvis said to me, "Let's go see your parents." I was happy and couldn't wait to tell them the news. I didn't even give my family any advance warning of our arrival. They were plainly surprised when they opened the door and saw Elvis and me standing together on the front porch. I kept my hand behind my back until we were in the den, where Elvis turned to me and said, "Show them your hand." I was still finding it difficult to hold my hand steady as I brought it from around my back. My parents looked at the ring, then back at us, speechless. "We're engaged," Elvis said, effectively making what he had told my mother on the phone in Las Vegas an exciting reality. I was touched to see that he seemed a little anxious as he waited for their reaction and approval. I wish I'd brought a camera to capture the completely stunned look on my parents' faces. My mother broke the silence finally, smiling and saying, "I'm so happy. And what a beautiful ring. I've never seen a diamond that large." My parents hugged the two of us. Serious, Elvis then said to them, "I'm going to take good care of Ginger. Don't you worry." Making direct eye contact with Elvis, my father smiled and said, "I'm sure you will." He shook his hand. Then Rosemary and Terry came in, and when we'd announced our news to them, the elation and congratulations started up again. Elvis and I stayed another hour or so, relaxing in my house and basking in my family's excitement. When we returned to Graceland later, I couldn't help but wonder what Vernon really thought, so I asked Elvis, "What was your father's reaction to our engagement?" He replied, "My daddy only asked, 'Son, does she do little things for you?' And I told him yes." It felt good hearing his answer, since I had tried to pamper Elvis in small ways, such as ordering food for him, rubbing his back, reading with him, and even placing cotton balls in his ears so he could sleep better. According to Elvis, his father had then responded, "Good. What could a 40-year-old woman do for you, like what can a 60-year-old do for me? Nothing." I didn't agree with what Vernon said, but didn't comment. Of course, I was glad that Vernon was comfortable with the age difference between Elvis and me, but hearing his words made me think that maybe Vernon brought Elvis up believing that's what a man needed, a younger woman to take care of him, since Elvis was with me and Vernon was with Sandy. I was glad to take care of Elvis, but equally glad that Elvis seemed keen on taking care of me, too. A few nights after our engagement, Elvis returned to my family's home to visit, and while he was there, invited his jeweler to come over. When Lowell arrived, he brought TCB and TLC necklaces with him. As he had done with me, Elvis slipped the symbolic necklaces over the heads of each of my family members. He wanted my family to know they were now part of his inner circle and family, and this was his way of making sure that others knew it as well. Impulsive, extravagant gestures remained the norm for Elvis. On the spur of the moment, he invited my whole family to Las Vegas again. He called the sheriff, and the sheriff called the mayor of Memphis to see if the district chief would give my brother permission to take the following day off from the fire department. The power of Elvis worked, and the chief said yes. We flew to Las Vegas, where we all stayed at the Hilton, and Elvis gave each member of my family $100 for gambling in the casino. Elvis preferred to remain in his room with me again, and I now felt that Elvis got bored sometimes, and just a change in location relaxed him. It would have been nice to see one of the Las Vegas shows, but I understood that, if Elvis went out, it would be a big deal. I was confident that one day, if I asked him, we would see some shows together. I didn't mind staying inside with him that night, and I felt especially happy knowing my family was being treated to a wonderful time. The two of us kept to our usual patterns and spent our time watching television and reading together in our hotel room. This time Elvis had brought The Impersonal Life, a book by Joseph Benner. It was a small book about self-discovery and looking within for true spiritual guidance. Elvis was seriously interested in the concepts and eager to share them with me. One never knew what Elvis might say or do, and at one point during the night, Elvis asked me to sit with him, close my eyes, and practice saying, "Be still and know that I am God." As we sat, chanting this phrase in an attempt to bring inner peace, Elvis suddenly got a cramp in his toe that didn't let up. So much for inner peace. He finally jumped up from the bed and, still holding onto his foot, began hopping around. He was laughing and cursing through the pain, which made me get tickled too. It took a little while for the cramp to go away, and it was pretty funny to watch how Elvis kept his sense of humor while in agony. As others were being entertained in showrooms across Las Vegas, I was getting a uniquely private performance as Elvis danced for me. Later, we connected with my family and visited with them for a while. We were in Las Vegas for only one night, and before I knew it, we were on our way back to Memphis. Not long after we returned to Graceland, Elvis again brought up his wish to buy my family a new home. He also mentioned again that I should have my own room and phone line so he could easily get in touch with me. I was still uncomfortable about Elvis buying a house for my family. I hadn't pursued the idea, nor had my family, but Elvis remained determined to follow through with this. He decided to take matters into his own hands one day and contacted his cousin Gigi, asking him to set up an appointment with a realtor to look at a home. Elvis also invited my parents to come to Graceland so they could go with us. My mother showed up, accompanied by Rosemary and my niece Amber. My father was working a late shift. We rode along with Gigi and Patsy to a 2-story home in the Whitehaven area, a neighborhood closer to Graceland. 2 realtors gave us a tour of the home. It was an older house and still occupied. As we walked around the first floor, Elvis said, "Well, don't look at it as it is, because there will be a lot of repairs that will need to be made on it. Picture it in a different light, with new carpeting and bathroom fixtures." We went upstairs. When I saw that the house had 5 bedrooms, I realized the house must be much more expensive than the one we lived in now. Elvis peered at the backyard through one of the upstairs windows. "You need a pool," he said. "The backyard looks small and there's no room for a pool." Elvis had been holding my hand the whole time. When he let go, Amber quickly took my hand. Elvis shot her a look. "Amber, watch it," he said with a grin. "You're getting too close." Before we left, Elvis told my mother, "Keep looking to see if you can find one in the neighborhood with 4 or 5 bedrooms. I'd like you to have one closer to Graceland, but you have to live in the house. It should be something that pleases you and has a room for each of you." With the difficulty that my parents were having in their marriage, I knew the last thing they would be focused on was looking for a new house. But we could all tell Elvis was extremely serious about doing this. His benevolent spirit continued to astonish me. Chapter 18. Learning how to be a part of Elvis's life was like running next to a fast-moving train, grabbing a door handle and jumping on board. That express train showed no signs of slowing down. His new tour began in Florida on February 12th. Elvis wanted me to see how he prepared for his shows, so at one point, he asked me to join him in his bathroom on the Lisa Marie. There, he mixed up a saline solution, tilted his head back, and poured the salt water down each nostril. This made him cough and helped clear his throat. Another time aboard the Lisa Marie, Elvis asked me to come into his bathroom before that night's show. He leaned against the sink and handed me a black eye pencil. He wanted me to touch up a few gray whiskers on his sideburns and a couple of gray hairs on his eyebrows. I never thought of his gray hair as detracting from his sex appeal in any way, but Elvis obviously didn't like it. I started to pencil in a small area. Our faces were close together. Elvis began staring at me and making subtle, comical facial expressions. He wouldn't stop, even when I begged him to, and I started laughing so hard my hand shook in the middle of giving him his touch-up. When I was finished, Elvis turned around to look in the mirror. "My God," he said in mock horror, "I look like Groucho Marx." Needless to say, he had to tone it down a bit. We laughed as he wiped some of the color off, and then Elvis shared a tip he'd learned working in films, showing me how to apply mascara a certain way to make your lashes look longer. I never could have imagined that I could learn makeup tips from a man, but here I was, still learning something new from Elvis every day. Because we were touring from one city to the next, Elvis and I usually didn't know what day it was. However, on Valentine's Day, I got a pleasant surprise. Elvis gave me not 1, but 4 different Valentine cards. I knew someone else must have picked out the cards, but it still touched me that he'd thought to do this. Inside the cards, Elvis had underlined certain verses and written some beautiful, personal words. A few nights later, I again looked over the cards Elvis had given me. Maybe because of the romantic things Elvis had said and done, I started thinking about my parents' marriage crumbling, reflecting on how their love had gone wrong, and wondering why it hadn't lasted. Here I was with Elvis, both of us looking forward to marriage, while theirs was possibly coming to an end. The thought made me sad. Elvis could tell something was bothering me. "What's wrong?" he asked. I hadn't wanted to burden him with any discussion about my parents' marital problems before, but I felt that part of being in a loving relationship meant being honest with someone. I hoped he would open up to me if something was bothering him, so I decided not to hide it anymore. I broke down, telling Elvis that my parents just weren't compatible with one another. Elvis was surprised. After I described what was going on at our house, he said, "Those are unpleasant conditions to be living under, and I don't want you living in that." I appreciated his sympathetic ear and concern, but I wasn't asking Elvis to do anything about it. He had asked me what was on my mind, and I had honestly opened up to him. I explained, adding, "Elvis, this is a situation that I believe only my parents can solve." I learned it wasn't possible for him to be a passive listener, as he seemed determined to want to help. "I'd like to speak with your mother about what's going on," he said. "I want to invite her and your sisters to see my last few shows." On February 19, Elvis flew them first class on American Airlines into Johnson City, Tennessee. During his show there, Elvis introduced me to his audience, along with my mother, Rosemary, and Terry. The next show was in Charlotte. On the flight between Tennessee and North Carolina, Elvis took time to talk with my mom about her marriage. He listened patiently to everything she was willing to share. I knew Elvis couldn't change how my parents felt about each other, but I deeply appreciated how much effort he was putting into trying to comfort her. He told my mother that he hoped things would work out and asked her to keep looking for a house. "It will be one less thing to worry about," Elvis promised her. During the Charlotte show, he introduced me again. This time, going down the line with my family, he said, "And all the little Aldens," acknowledging Terry as Miss Tennessee. With a mischievous look, he then started walking toward Terry. Terry began shaking her head, and under her breath I heard her say, "No, no." Elvis ignored this. Looking straight at her, he asked Terry to join him on stage. He had stopped his whole show to single her out. Terry finally stepped up onto the stage beside him, blushing furiously. "Play that weird piece you play," Elvis teased. "No," Terry said, but Elvis motioned for her to do it, and finally she took a seat behind the piano, where she quickly played part of Toccata. As Terry stood to leave, she turned to Elvis and jokingly said, "I'll get you for this," forgetting his microphone was in his hand. We later had a good laugh, wondering if any others had heard her. The performance in Charlotte was Elvis's last show of the tour. We flew back to Memphis afterward, where he could enjoy nearly a month off. Once we were back in Memphis, Elvis continued to visit my parents' home, sometimes by motorcycle and not always under the cover of darkness. I never knew when Elvis might appear. If I was at home sleeping and heard the roar of a motorcycle, I always woke up wondering if it could be him. I could tell he was getting real comfortable with my family, which made me feel great. Occasionally, Elvis would enter our house and right off the bat would ask, "Where's Rosemary?" Looking for her, he'd march down the hall and flip on her bedroom light. One time, my brother happened to be at the house when Elvis came to visit, and Elvis brought up the possibility of training Mike as a guard to work for him. My brother thanked him and said he would certainly consider it. On another occasion, Elvis decided to approach my father about my parents' marriage. He sat with my dad in Rosemary's room and talked with him for a little while. Later, Elvis told me he didn't know if their conversation had helped fix anything, but it was a start. I was amazed by how caring and good-hearted he was with both of my parents. Elvis really seemed to be taking them on as his own family now that we were engaged. I thought that boded well for our future as a couple, because family was so important to both of us. I had never lost my love of motorcycles. I was thrilled, therefore, when we were at Graceland one night, and Elvis finally asked me to ride with him. He called for Billy Smith, and when Billy entered the room, Elvis looked at him and said, "Saddle up the Harley Hogs." Billy left, and figuring that Elvis must own a few Harley-Davidson motorcycles, I asked him why he called them that. "Because they hog the road," he said. As usual, he left his pajamas on, stepped into his blue jumpsuit, buckled his black stage belt around his waist, and tucked one of his guns inside it. Going into his dressing room, he returned with his black leather jacket and handed me another one, saying, "Here, I want you to have this." It was a beautiful jacket in silver leather, with multicolored flames and a black eagle painted on its back. Elvis handed me a helmet, and we walked downstairs. Stopping by his grandmother's bedroom, we said a quick hello and continued out back. I thought it was sweet that Elvis usually checked on Dodger whenever he was going out. The minute I put the helmet on, Elvis looked at me and began to laugh. "You look like a lollipop head," he said. I was amused as well, knowing my head was on the small side and the helmet was huge on me. Billy and a couple of the guys got on motorcycles, and straddling his own, Elvis said, "Come on, chicken neck, get on." I did, and we slowly took off down the driveway. My neck couldn't support the weight of the helmet, and I kept banging my head into Elvis's. He started laughing, and pretty soon we were nearly hysterical, because every time he slowed down, my helmet would go clank against his. We rode up and down Elvis Presley Boulevard, where Elvis playfully yelled to a couple of passing cars, "Get off my street!" He was enjoying himself, and I was having a blast. At one point, Elvis had to use a restroom, so we stopped at a gas station. Some fans had followed us. Stepping off the motorcycle, Elvis signed a few autographs. He always took time with his fans. Before long, we were back on the motorcycle, and we rode around some more, circling through parking lots, then returned to Graceland. It had been a fun night, and I hoped there would be many more like it. I was now actively envisioning a future with Elvis, and I delighted in imagining the life we would share, a life that I hoped would be enriched by pets and children. Soon, I took one step closer to that future. I'd always loved Great Danes, and I'd been entertaining the idea of getting one. I was surprised when I mentioned this to Elvis one day, and he told me he'd owned Great Danes in the past. I thought it was neat that we both liked the same breed. Excited by the prospect of sharing and caring for a pet together, I told Elvis that, when the dog was a puppy, I could keep it at my parents' house, and after he and I were married, it would have room to run at Graceland. This got us talking about dogs, and I could tell Elvis had a soft spot for animals by the way he reminisced about some of the pets he'd owned over the years. My parents had allowed us to have a variety of pets, and as we traded stories, he suggested that we get one. I later found a listing in our local paper for some puppies. One day, unbeknownst to Elvis, I drove to a home in Sayreville, Tennessee, and purchased a black male Great Dane with a small white star on his chest. In honor of Elvis's opening theme to his concerts, I decided to name him Odyssey. I couldn't wait to show him to Elvis. I brought the puppy to Graceland. Gawky with large paws and long legs, Odyssey was big at just a couple of months old. The puppy didn't have any experience with stairs, so hoping no one would see me, I stood over him, took one paw at a time, and slowly helped Odyssey walk up the front stairs. Elvis and Billy were chatting in Lisa's room when I arrived. I entered the doorway, lugging my new puppy with me, and said, "This is Odyssey." Surprised, they started laughing. Billy began joking around, calling the dog Oddball. I was a little sensitive about it, which Elvis noticed. He gave Billy an annoyed look and said he thought Odyssey was cute. Billy left the room then, and Elvis apologized. He said he'd looked in that paper too, where he'd seen the same ad and was going to call. Over the next few days, I divided my time between trying to train Odyssey at home and going to see Elvis. He was clearly thinking about what our future would look like together too, because one day, Elvis said, "You have to learn that you are the lady of the house." "Okay," I agreed. It warmed me to hear this. Although I didn't live at Graceland yet, it was wonderful to know that Elvis was already thinking of me in this way. At the same time, I was a little worried, wondering how I could easily slip into this role without disturbing or offending those who were running Graceland behind the scenes. I didn't want to step on anyone's toes. I hadn't had any opportunities to hang out downstairs and visit with the other people who were regulars in the house, so I hadn't formed a close relationship with any of them. In addition, I also came from a middle-class upbringing, one where you cleaned your own house and cooked your own meals. Having maids and aides at your beck and call any time of day or night was still a novelty for me, one I'd been trying to get used to while being with Elvis. I was confident, though, that the more time I spent at Graceland, the more comfortable I would start to feel, that I would know the right things to say and do as his wife. Meanwhile, Elvis continued to demonstrate his growing trust and commitment to me by giving me the remote control for an electric gate that opened onto the back of his property. A side road led to the gatehouse at this rear entrance, where a guard was always on duty. Elvis often used this road when he wanted to come and go from Graceland privately. Now he wanted me to be able to arrive or leave without notice whenever I wanted. It was a small step, but a big gesture. One more way of him saying, "I want you to have full access into my life." Another evening, Elvis glanced about his bedroom with a thoughtful look and suddenly announced that he wanted to redecorate his home. He grew excited as we started talking about the possibilities. "Graceland should come alive again," Elvis said cheerfully. "After we're married, I want to redo my bedroom first." He paused with a sigh. "Then comes the monstrous task of downstairs," he said, turning to me then and taking my hand. "I want it to be a lot of what you like, too," he said. "That'll be fun," I agreed, excited about the prospect of redecorating Graceland. Although the idea of this undertaking was a little intimidating, I felt sure Elvis would guide me through it successfully. This was something we could do together that would make me feel more a part of his home. Interior design also appealed to my artistic side. "What colors for downstairs?" he asked. I thought about this for a minute, then replied, "Green would be pretty, with some plants and maybe a large aquarium." Elvis nodded. "Okay." He said another one of the things he'd like to do was redecorate the ladies' bathroom in his office. He asked me to choose colors for that also. "Turquoise and white would be nice," I said at once. I'd always loved that combination for a bathroom. He then brought up redecorating his Palm Springs home and putting in a screening room, making it like a small movie theater with king and queen chairs for the two of us. Talking about how he wanted to change some things caused me to truly begin visualizing the details of what our life together could be like for the first time. I was thrilled and swept up in his vision, adding my own ideas here and there. One afternoon I woke at Graceland before Elvis did and decided to go downstairs to look around a bit. If we were going to redecorate the house, I wanted to be able to consider our choices, and I didn't feel like I knew the downstairs rooms that well because most of my time had been spent upstairs. I walked into the dining room and began looking at some objects arranged on a shelf in a built-in corner cabinet. At one point, I turned around and was startled to see the maid Lottie seated at the dining room table watching me. I hadn't heard her come in. "Hi," I said. Lottie smiled and greeted me in return, but I felt some trepidation, as if I'd sneaked into a room I wasn't supposed to be in at all. For me, trying to feel at home at Graceland was like trying to feel at home in the White House. I turned back and continued to examine the objects on the shelves, a little self-conscious now. "You can change anything you want," Lottie said, surprising me. Elvis must have said something to her about me being the lady of the house, I thought happily, as I turned around to smile at Lottie again. "It's all fine," I replied. "I hadn't come downstairs to start changing things. I just wanted to look around a bit. I also wanted Lottie to feel comfortable with me." Although I appreciated how deferential she was acting, I knew myself too well. I would never feel comfortable ordering her or any of the other staff around, lady of the house or not. Chapter 19. Toward the end of February, Elvis asked, "Have you ever been to Hawaii?" I was aware that Elvis had made a few movies in Hawaii and had performed a concert there years ago, but I didn't know if he'd been back recently. Elvis still didn't know how little I traveled before meeting him, I realized. "No," I answered. A smile crept across his face. "I'd really like to take you there," he said. Wow, I thought, that would be a dream come true. I'd always wanted to go to Hawaii. "I'd love to see it," I said. And so it was settled. Elvis decided he wanted to leave on March 3rd and graciously invited my whole family. Only my sisters would be able to make this trip, and my parents offered to take care of Odyssey. The evening of our departure, I was sitting with Terry and Rosemary in the living room at Graceland, packed and waiting for Elvis to finish getting ready upstairs, when the doorbell rang. One of the maids opened it. A man, dressed in a suit and carrying a briefcase, stepped into the foyer, accompanied by a woman. Walking past my sisters and me, they went upstairs, leaving us wondering who they were. Not long afterward, someone asked me to come upstairs. I entered Elvis's office and saw him seated at his desk, talking with Charlie and the two strangers. Elvis introduced the man to me as his attorney, Beecher Smith, and the woman as Beecher's wife. Elvis's will was lying on the desk in front of them. "I need witnesses and you and Charlie are close by," Elvis said. This was the first business document I'd ever seen placed before him. It was obvious that Elvis didn't want to be bothered with it, since he started making comments about Hawaii and seemed anxious to leave. I noticed that, on the last page of his will, the year 1976 had been crossed through, and 1977 was written in its place. Elvis didn't read anything in my presence. He just quickly signed the will, and then Charlie, Mrs. Smith, and I signed as witnesses. I never wondered about the will, or the timing of Elvis signing the document at that time. I just looked at it as a little bit of business that Elvis had to do before leaving. A little while later, we were on the way to the airport, all of us excited about the trip. I mentioned that it was an extra special treat for Terry because it was her birthday. What a great birthday gift. Elvis smiled broadly and wished her a happy one. I had become aware at Graceland that Charlie and Billy and Joe Smith were also going to Hawaii, but it wasn't until we arrived at the airport and boarded the Lisa Marie that I realized how many people were actually gathered for the trip. Aides, stepbrothers, wives, girlfriends, bodyguards, Lamar, Larry, and even Dr. Nicopoulos and his entire family were all on board the plane. Discovering this reminded me once again that Elvis's generous impulses weren't reserved only for me and my family, but bestowed on all those around him. Elvis greeted everyone and then asked me to join him at the back of the plane. I suspected he felt most comfortable being in the bedroom during takeoff. After the Lisa Marie was in the air, we moved up front to visit with various members of the group. Elvis had never met some of the girls who were coming along. One of them was Lamar's date. She had a funny sense of humor, and she hit it off with Rosemary and Terry. A little while into the flight, my sisters told me they had been chatting with her when Lamar took hold of her hand, and she looked at them with a tolerant smile. She had then rolled her eyes at my sisters behind Lamar's back, as if to say, "This is something I have to do." It was obvious, I thought, that this woman had come along on the trip only to meet Elvis. She later confirmed this by telling my sisters that she didn't really want to be with Lamar. We landed in Oakland, California, where Ed Parker and his wife, Leilani, boarded the plane. With their addition to our group of travelers, I thought there had to be at least 30 people now on board. Before long, we were in the air again and soaring over the Pacific Ocean. During this portion of the trip, Elvis mainly stayed in the back of the plane with my sisters and me with the door closed. He was in a silly mood. At one point, he started talking about rats and said he thought his aide Dean looked like one. Cutting up and laughing, Elvis joked about rats, cheese, and other people on board he thought looked like rats. My sisters and I had him pretend he was in a movie with cameras rolling. As if envisioning rats all around him, Elvis hunched his shoulders and with a panic-stricken look suddenly shouted, "Rats, millions of them. They're all around me, crawling all over my body." Elvis had us all in stitches. It was great to see him having so much fun. The three of us egged him on, and he continued to act out various silly scenarios with rats. After a while, Rosemary, Terry, and I went up front to get a snack and a drink. Following us out, Elvis took a seat in the room just outside the bedroom, and Dr. Nicopoulos walked back and began chatting with him. My sisters and I got our refreshments and headed back toward the bedroom. Elvis was still in a conversation with Dr. Nicopoulos, and, as we passed them, Rosemary looked at Elvis. "Would you like some cheese?" she asked. He laughed, shushed her, and said, "Get out of here, Rosemary." Elvis soon joined us in the bedroom and asked Rosemary, "So what's going on up front?" "Oh, not much," she said, then casually told him what a few people were doing, including Charlie, saying that he was talking to Ed about some of the books Elvis had been reading. When she mentioned this, Elvis asked, "Charlie's doing what?" Elvis then told us that Ed was a devout Mormon, and said he was worried about Charlie drinking and saying the wrong things about his books. I sensed that Elvis didn't want to upset Ed or disrespect him in any way. Elvis called for Charlie to come to the back. When Charlie walked in, Elvis said, "Charlie, man, be careful how you talk about my books with Ed." Charlie looked puzzled. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, but Elvis didn't want to hear it. Looking a little hurt, Charlie slunk out the door. As we approached Hawaii, Elvis began rhapsodizing about the islands. Later, Elvis whispered to me, "Can you imagine if we got married here? It would blow everybody away." I froze for a moment. Is he seriously considering this? Then, as if reminding himself, Elvis said, "God will tell me when the time is right, though." When the Lisa Marie touched down on the island of Oahu, Elvis made the moment all the more magical as he began softly singing Blue Hawaii to my sisters and me. I couldn't believe we were actually here. As I followed Elvis outside onto a mobile stairway, the first thing that hit me was the overwhelming fragrance of flowers. Hawaiians greeted us and placed beautiful leis around our necks after we descended the steps. My sisters and I rode with Elvis in a limousine from the airport, while the rest of the group followed in a small bus. About 20 minutes later, we pulled onto the grounds of the Rainbow Tower at Hilton Hawaiian Village. It looked like a tropical paradise with its gardens, ponds, and waterfalls. Elvis had reserved a suite of rooms on the 31st floor and arranged for Terry and Rosemary to be in a bedroom across the living room from ours. A few of the guys came in to help us settle in our room. They brought in the bags, laid out Elvis's books, and left a contact sheet so we'd know who was on duty and when. Elvis eagerly took me by the hand and led me on to the suite's balcony, where I took in the unbelievably gorgeous, postcard-perfect view of Waikiki Beach below, and, in the distance, a volcanic crater that Elvis said was Diamond Head. I couldn't wait to see it all up close. Rosemary and Terry were going downstairs to look around, but before they did, Elvis remembered Terry's birthday and thoughtfully called a jeweler to come to our suite with a selection of pieces. Generous as always, Elvis picked out a beautiful ring and gave it to Terry. My sisters eventually left, and a few other people stopped by our suite to greet us. Before long, however, Elvis went into the bedroom and sat on the bed, where he picked out some books and appeared to be ready to read and relax. Could he really want to read now, I wondered, when there was so much to see? Then it hit me. We'd been up almost 24 hours. I was too excited to feel the effects of jet lag or our sleepless night. Now I realized that Elvis was probably getting tired, so I joined him on the bed. We read for a little while and then slept. When we woke up, I thought Elvis might have something planned for us to do or something he might want to show me, since he'd been here before. He surprised me, though, by saying I should go with Terry and Rosemary to the beach in front of the hotel. I wanted Elvis to come with us so badly, but how far could he walk outside without being recognized and most probably mobbed? Not far, I realized. Still, I hated the thought of just leaving him sitting here, alone, inside while the rest of us went out and enjoyed ourselves. There had to be a way to get him out of the hotel. My sisters were back in the suite by now. The three of us tried talking Elvis into sneaking downstairs incognito. Rosemary suggested a wig in different classes, but he shook his head. "Nah," he said, "I don't want to wear that." It was a beautiful hotel, but now I wondered who had arranged for us to stay in this particular place. a hotel where Elvis clearly couldn't go outside and relax because there were too many people around. When a few members of his entourage showed up in the suite to visit with Elvis, knowing he wouldn't be alone, I decided to accompany my sisters to the beach. It truly was paradise, complete with palm trees and clear turquoise ocean. Rosemary stayed in the shade, but Terry and I picked out a spot on the sand where we could lie down on our towels and soak up the sun. Rosemary was the smart one, it turned out. Terry and I were both oblivious to the strength of the sun's rays in Hawaii. We weren't on the beach long, but when we returned to the suite, Terry, who was fairer than I, discovered that her body and face were seriously sunburned. Her lips had blown up like little sausages. This was years before collagen would become fashionable, and Terry was mortified. My face was also badly burned, and my eyelids were swollen. The two of us were extremely embarrassed. The minute Elvis saw us, he asked Larry to come to the suite to try some healing techniques on Terry. Larry arrived, and Terry lay down on her bed. As Rosemary and I stood by watching, Larry and Elvis placed their hands a few inches above Terry's back and legs, telling her to think of healing colors. Elvis mentioned something about aloe vera gel and requested an aide to find us some. He told Terry she should spread it over her sunburn. Neither my sisters nor I were familiar with the gel, but Terry was in pain, and I hoped that one of the things Elvis and Larry were kindly trying to do would comfort her. Before long, someone brought up some gel, and Terry and I liberally applied it. It did help us feel a little better. Hawaiian music continuously played outside by the beach. Later that evening, my sisters and I dared Elvis to go on the balcony and sing along. He walked out, I stepped up beside him, and he began to sing. It was another perfect moment, as the flames from tiki torches softly lit the beach below us, and I gazed out over the ocean while listening to Elvis serenade us. At one point, I decided to call our parents to let them know we had arrived safely. I went with Rosemary and Terry into their room and dialed an operator to place a collect call. Elvis walked in and asked what I was doing. "I'm trying to reach our parents." He took the phone from my hand and said into the receiver, "This is Elvis Presley, and I'm trying to get connected." Of course the operator didn't believe him. My sisters and I started laughing as he began singing in an effort to convince the woman. It worked. Within seconds, I was speaking with my parents and letting them know that we were all fine. Elvis relaxed for the rest of that evening, visiting with a few people in our suite, and then we went to bed. When we woke the next day, he decided to send me shopping with Rosemary and Terry. Still wondering when, or even if, Elvis would ever go outside, I put on a crocheted halter top and some jeans. As I started to leave, Elvis stopped me. "Ginger, I don't want you to go out like that," he said. Confused, I looked at him for a minute, wondering what was wrong with my outfit. "I'd like you to wear a shirt over it," he added. Why was he saying that? Was he being protective? Did he not want other men looking at me? This was the first time I'd ever seen Elvis react this way to something I had chosen to wear. I was flattered by his concern, no matter what had provoked it. "Okay," I said. I put a shirt on over my top and left with my sisters, who said they'd gone downstairs earlier and run into Lamar's date, who was as red as a lobster. The other woman had told them she purposely got sunburned the first day so Lamar wouldn't touch her. She also had a pack of gum with her, and said she was constantly telling Lamar that she was going out for gum, so she didn't have to be in the same room with him. Terry and I got tickled as we realized that, for us, being sunburned was painful, but for Lamar's date, it was apparently a relief. While others dined out, my sisters and I ate in the suite with Elvis. After dinner, some members of the group came in to visit, and later Elvis mentioned something about Mai Tais. This surprised me. Except for Charlie enjoying a cocktail and a bottle of vodka I'd noticed once partially sticking out of a backpack Ricky carried on tour, I had yet to see Elvis or others around him drink. When my sisters and I told Elvis we'd never had Mai Tais, he asked one of the guys to order some sent up to the suite. My sisters and I each had one, but Elvis drank 3. Not long afterward, he began marching in place. We all started laughing, especially when Elvis stood up on the couch and started walking back and forth across the cushions. His face soon flushed red, though, and Elvis quickly sat down, telling us he shouldn't really drink because he had high blood pressure and was taking pills for it. I was glad he told us. I'd had no idea. Later on, Elvis called for a jeweler to come up again. This time, he picked out puka shell necklaces for everyone, including himself. Kindly thinking of my mother, Elvis purchased one for her, too. He also made the decision that night to rent a beach house so he could have some privacy. I was glad, feeling that now he'd be able to go outside and have fun with the rest of us. Well into the early morning hours, my sisters and I were alone with Elvis. He was still in a jovial mood and brought up rats again. He was having fun, talking loudly, and every so often shouting out something to do with rats. I loved cutting up with him, seeing him act like a big kid, and having such a good time with my sisters. I was happy that Elvis seemed to have left his cares behind on the mainland. Before going to sleep that morning, Elvis told me that if I wanted to look around in the hotel shops downstairs later, I should, because we would be leaving that afternoon to view some houses. When Elvis and I woke, I asked my sisters if they wanted to accompany me. Terry was still in pain from her sunburn, so she opted to stay in her room, but Rosemary said she would go. The two of us browsed through the stores downstairs for a while. When we returned, Terry met us in the living room and told us that Elvis had knocked on her door and come into her room. He had wanted yogurt and handed her his list with the entourage's room numbers, asking her to call someone to get him some. She had gone into the living room and started calling. No one was answering in any room, and Elvis began getting irritated as she went through the complete list. None of them checked to see if I needed anything, Elvis had told her angrily. These aren't friends here. Wanting to help him, Terry had gone out into the hall and spoken with the guards stationed by the elevators, requesting yogurt for Elvis. It was soon brought up to the room. Luckily, Elvis was in a better mood by the time I saw him, but I was sure he would have some hard words to say to a select few, if he hadn't already. To look at beach houses, Elvis got dressed in a light blue jogging suit, a navy nylon jacket, a pair of sneakers, and a terry cloth hat. It was different to see him dressed like this. Jeans were popular, but I had yet to see Elvis wear any. Now I ask him why. Because I had to when I was little, he replied. I suspected wearing jeans reminded Elvis of a time in his youth when his family had little money, and that was all they could afford. I gathered a few of my things and left the hotel with Elvis, my sisters, and a few of the others. It was a half-hour ride to the other side of the island. From the windows of the limousine, I drank in the lush green countryside. The beauty of the island was beyond amazing. We arrived at a private home and walked through it with a local liaison. In one room was a large window with a bizarre feature. When you pushed a button nearby, it looked like it was raining outside. Elvis sat on a couch, relaxing for a moment and contemplating the house. Joe Esposito had come along with us. He had a camera with him and began taking pictures of Elvis. Rosemary had taken a seat on the floor nearby and was paying attention to some others who were chatting. Suddenly, I noticed Elvis cut his eyes over at her. Rosemary looked back at him, smiled, then turned her attention elsewhere. A big grin spread across his face as he continued to watch her. Shortly, he stood up and, as he walked past her, he suddenly turned and pounced. Rosemary fell backward with Elvis on top of her. Someone snapped a picture of their spontaneous tussle while we all laughed. Then Elvis stood up and helped Rosemary to her feet. Elvis decided he didn't care for the first house, so we went to see another. The second home was close to the beach and had access to a neighbor's nearby pool. Elvis liked it and immediately decided this was where we would stay. He put my sisters in a bedroom close to ours and placed Billy and Joe Smith in a room at the end of the hall. Dr. Nicopoulos would be in a room on the other side of the home, and, as usual, Elvis wanted an aide or two staying at the house also. The remainder of the group would stay at the hotel. Before long, the rest of the group arrived at the house, and Elvis decided he wanted to go to the beach. It was so warm out, we found some scissors and cut off the long sleeves to the jacket of his jogging suit. I assumed someone would be going back to the hotel to bring our suitcases. Meanwhile, a group of us walked with Elvis down to the water, where he and I sat on some small foam boards on the sand. A few people took a dip in the ocean, but Elvis and I remained on the beach, peacefully enjoying the serene view and watching the others swim. It felt wonderful to relax with him out in the sunshine. Before long, Joe pulled out his camera again and began taking more pictures. Beach mats were soon brought down to us, and we rolled them open to have more room to sit or lie down. I had a Polaroid camera with me. Out of respect for Elvis's privacy, I had yet to take any photos of him. However, now that I saw Joe snap away, I decided to snap a couple of shots too. A few others began shooting photographs as well. Elvis sat with various people, joking and cutting up for photo ops. A short time later, Rosemary told me that when she'd been sitting beside Elvis, he had confessed to wishing only Polaroids were being taken. The problem with film being developed, he explained, was that the person doing it could then decide to sell the photographs. This was another reminder that his celebrity had sometimes taken away some of his enjoyment from ordinary activities that the rest of us take for granted. Elvis and I finally fell asleep near dawn. When I woke that afternoon, Terry told me that when she and Rosemary first opened their bedroom door, they had seen a huge hunk of cheese sitting on the floor in their doorway. I laughed, pleased that all of our joking about rats seemed to have left quite an impression on Elvis. Someone had gone out earlier and bought some tops for Elvis to wear, but they were short-sleeved cotton sweatshirts. It was so warm out that I took some scissors and cut the neck out of one, making it larger so he could get it over his head more easily, and hoping the more open neckline would let more air in for him and keep him cooler. I didn't know if Elvis had any shorts or a swimsuit with him, since he chose to wear a pair of lightweight pants, but I decided to look for some shirts that were made of a lighter material for him. He arranged for someone to take my sisters and me shopping, and we browsed around at some nearby stores. I purchased a few shirts I hoped he would like. When we returned, I found out that Elvis and some of the guys in the group had played touch football while we were gone. I hated missing the chance to see them play, but I could tell it had gotten rough at times because Elvis's cousin Billy had a swollen knee. I was standing in the kitchen a bit later when Joe's girlfriend Shirley came in. I hadn't spoken much with her since our shopping venture in Las Vegas, but we were always cordial whenever we saw each other. As we talked, Shirley said she'd had lunch with Priscilla Presley not long ago, and that Priscilla had asked her if Elvis and I were engaged. This surprised me. I had known she was close friends with Priscilla. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her, well, she has an engagement ring," Shirley said. I knew the news of our engagement must have circulated throughout the entire group by now, but I suddenly realized that I had no memory of ever being congratulated by Shirley, Joe, Dr. Nicopoulos, Lamar, or a few others who regularly surrounded Elvis. This certainly was strange and inexplicable. "Have you set a wedding date?" Shirley asked. "No." "You should mention marriage to Elvis to push him a little," she said. "You should bring it up more." I didn't like this idea. I remembered Elvis once telling me that he thought when it came to marriage, it was the man's place to ask, and Elvis had already told me a few times that God would come through and tell him when the time was right. I wanted him to be sure. A red flag went up. Was Shirley trying to help me or hurt me? "Shirley, I don't want to do that," I said, feeling awkward. We dropped the subject, and I left the kitchen a few minutes later. Unfortunately, now when it came to Shirley, I felt my guard had to be up. Elvis had started rising a little earlier during the day and was spending more time in the fresh air. However, he still often wanted me to read with him inside, and when he did go out, he didn't hang around by the pool for very long, and he never seemed to want to go swimming. With so many other people around, and the strong possibility of some taking photos, I sensed that Elvis remained fully clothed because he didn't feel comfortable about taking his shirt off. I guessed maybe he was self-conscious about the scars on his back left by some of his stage suits, but I had seen him without his shirt on, and he looked good. From time to time I tried to coax him into the water, but because I couldn't get him into the ocean, I tried to enjoy myself anyway and usually swam with Terry. Elvis and I had yet to try any of the local Hawaiian delicacies. He was mainly sticking with certain foods he liked, familiar comfort foods like pizza and cheeseburgers, though he did drink a fair amount of papaya juice, which was so readily available. The first time Elvis ventured out among the general public in Hawaii was for a shopping trip to a local mall. Amazingly, we actually made it into one of the stores without anyone noticing who he was. We browsed the aisles together and came across some large candles shaped like pyramids. Intrigued, Elvis decided to purchase a few. He also found a mother-of-pearl crucifix on a stand that he liked. I was looking around the store with my sisters when Joe came over and told us not to show Elvis anything expensive because he would probably buy it. According to Joe, Linda Thompson had once pointed out a costly bubblegum machine to Elvis, even after Joe had asked her not to show it to him. Sure enough, Elvis bought it, and he didn't need things like that, Joe said. I wondered if Joe always managed Elvis's spending money. On the one hand, it was nice that Joe seemed to be watching over it, but on the other hand, should Joe be saying what Elvis should or shouldn't have? Joe didn't know us well, but my sisters and I weren't the sort of people who would take advantage of Elvis's generosity or tell him to buy things. It put a little damper on the enjoyment I'd been feeling while looking at things with Elvis, because the prices on most items in the store weren't visible, and I was now afraid to comment or point out anything at all. In a second shop, Elvis admired some amazing jeweled robes. He began choosing some for my sisters, Joe Smith, himself, and me. Suddenly, I noticed people gathering outside the store, and knew word must be spreading that Elvis was here. Elvis spotted them at the same time and decided it was time to leave. I certainly understood others wanting to see him, but I did wish he could have stayed out for a little while longer. I never knew Elvis to personally carry a wallet. After he'd chosen the robes, a member of his staff got in line to pay for his items. As we stood near the counter, a man was buying something. Elvis asked who it was for, and the man, understandably stunned to see Elvis standing beside him, said it was a gift for his wife. Elvis then paid for the man's item as well. On the way home, Elvis wanted to show us a tourist attraction, so he asked our driver to stop at an area called the Halona Blowhole. This was a natural occurrence created by lava tubes from volcanic eruptions. As we watched from a lookout area, waves crashed against the formations below us, and every once in a while some ocean water sprayed high into the air. Before long, some of the other tourists gathered at the site recognized Elvis and approached us. He kindly posed for pictures and signed some autographs before leaving. Hawaii was an amazingly beautiful place, but in addition to the stunning scenery, it was also a wonderful opportunity for Elvis to relax and have fun. There was a ping-pong table in the house, and once I challenged Elvis to a game. I thought it would be fun, and it would do Elvis good to get some exercise. I went to where he'd taken his customary pose on the bed with some books and asked him to play. "No, I don't want to," he said. Taunting him, I said, "You can't. That's why." Elvis grinned as I kept at him. Finally, he walked with me into the room with the ping-pong table, and we started to play. We hit the ball around a few times, but then Elvis started slamming the ball so hard at me that it became impossible to return his shots. Some of the aides were in the room with us. Later, one of them told me he couldn't believe it, as he'd never seen Elvis play ping-pong before. I wasn't sure you could actually call the game we'd been playing ping-pong, but it was fun while it lasted. Another time, Elvis began showing my sisters and me some karate moves in his bedroom. Rosemary decided to challenge him and asked, "What if you were on the beach and had only one arm, and someone kicked sand in your face?" Elvis sat on the floor, and Rosemary approached him, pretending to kick sand at him. Using one arm, Elvis grabbed her leg, and trying to be gentle, knocked her off her feet. Terry and I were lying across the bed laughing at the two of them. Rosemary stood back up, looked at Elvis, and asked, "Okay, what if you had no arms and only legs?" She came walking toward him again. Using only his legs, Elvis had her back down on the floor in the blink of an eye. Elvis started laughing. Still, Rosemary kept putting his karate expertise to the test by proposing various challenging scenarios. Elvis demonstrated several moves on Rosemary while Terry and I cheered the two of them on. At one point, they were both down on the floor when Rosemary managed to get Elvis in a headlock. "I got him," she shouted. Meanwhile, Elvis was beginning to twist her body into a pretzel. Terry and I had been mainly rooting for Rosemary. Finally, taking a break to rest, Elvis picked up a large glass filled with ice water from his night table and began leering at me. "I dare you to throw it," I teased. Continuing to stare at me, he said with a smirk, "Don't dare me." And before I had time to blink, I was covered in freezing water. I went into the bathroom, dried off with a towel, and filled my hand with shaving cream. I kept my hand behind my back as I walked out. Elvis was now facing my sisters. Walking up behind him, I said, "Elvis?" As he turned around, I quickly smeared some shaving cream on his face and hauled out of there. I flew into the main room, passing the ping-pong table with Elvis in close pursuit. A few of the guys sitting in the room looked up in surprise as Elvis chased me around the table. Laughing, Elvis finally gave up and walked back into his room. I waited a bit before going back into the bedroom, unsure if Elvis would have any other tricks up his sleeve. Lucky for me, all was safe upon my return. Unfortunately, the trip was not all fun and laughter. On the afternoon of March 9th, Elvis saw a television report about 12 Hanafi Muslims taking over 3 buildings in Washington, D.C., and holding people hostage. I saw Elvis's deep love for our country as he became furious and talked about offering his plane to assist in some way. He even mentioned leaving Hawaii to go to Washington so he could speak with President Carter. I reasoned with him, along with Larry and Charlie, convincing him there was nothing he could do and that we'd have to trust President Carter to sort things out. Eventually he calmed down, and fortunately the hostages were released a few days later. Elvis had been drinking papaya juice excessively that day. He woke up shortly after going to bed, requesting more. He had consumed quite a bit of juice right before going to sleep, and my mind flashed to his problem with fluid retention and bloating. Against my better instincts, I went into the kitchen to get him more papaya juice, but there wasn't any left. I came back and told him we had run out. Elvis then wanted me to wake an aide and send him out to get more. "Can it wait, Elvis?" I asked. In a more normal situation, I would have been happy to see that he got some juice, but I felt it would be better for his health if Elvis curbed his intake. I was hoping he would just doze off again, but he became increasingly adamant about getting some more juice. I remembered that Vernon had once asked Elvis if I did little things for him. I usually did, but I decided to resist this request for his own good. "Elvis, this much juice isn't healthy," I said. I could tell he was angry by the way Elvis left the room without speaking and went into his cousin's bedroom, shutting the door. I hadn't expected this reaction and wondered what Elvis would tell Billy and Joe. Now I felt anger welling up inside me, too. Here I was, trying to do the right thing for him. But Elvis was behaving like a little boy. I stood firm and didn't follow him. A little while later, Billy came into my room. "Ginger, Elvis wants to see you," he said. I thought it was odd that Billy didn't bother to ask what was going on. I followed him back into his room and saw Elvis seated on the bed. Hoping he'd calm down, I was prepared to tell him again that I was just trying to help. But before I could say anything, Elvis looked at me and announced, "We're leaving Hawaii because of you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Were we actually going to leave Hawaii over papaya juice? I glanced at Billy, but he and his wife sat quietly, watching the drama unfold. I wondered what Elvis had said to them and what everyone would think, but I was determined not to back down. Meanwhile, Elvis was clearly bent on staying mad at me. He started saying some unkind things, insinuating that I didn't love him because of this. This shocked me. I was standing up to him because I did love him. His reaction hurt me deeply. I had been trying to do a good thing, and this wasn't the Elvis I loved. I was pretty sure now that the medication he had taken must be responsible for the inexplicable change in his personality. My confusion and embarrassment were overshadowed by my anger and hurt over Elvis actually saying we'd leave Hawaii because of this. I walked out of the room while Elvis was still talking, shut the door, and ran down the hall to our room. I closed that door as well, hoping Elvis might return to normal if I gave him time to calm down. I sat down on the bed. Moments later, I heard Billy's door fly open and heavy footsteps marching down the hall. Our bedroom door flew open. Elvis stormed into the room with a wild look in his eyes and slapped me on the side of my rib cage. "No one ever walks out on me when I'm talking," he said. I started crying, more surprised by his furious action than hurt by the sting of his open hand. I was afraid to move on the bed. Who was this person? Where was the Elvis I loved? When he saw how upset I was, Elvis quickly realized what he had done and bent down to put his arms around me, saying he was sorry. He told me we really weren't leaving, but that he had just said that. Why? I wondered. Had Elvis just said that to scare me? And what was the purpose in that? I continued to cry in his arms. Although Elvis hadn't hit me hard, he had done the inconceivable. He had hit me. This was more traumatic emotionally than physically. I could tell by his voice that Elvis was deeply remorseful for having struck me. Still, he didn't say what I needed to hear. "I understand. You were only trying to help me." He had been used to getting his own way for so long that I think Elvis honestly felt he knew what was best for his own health. The dark mood that had transformed Elvis into someone I didn't recognize reminded me of the incident in Palm Springs over the yogurt. There, too, I'd only been trying to help him. If this was his reaction over yogurt and papaya juice, how could I ever say anything to him about his sleep medication? I had never spoken to Elvis about the concern I had over that. When I had first become aware of the sleep packets being left for Elvis each night, I had questioned whether Elvis's insomnia was just in his mind. In my experience, I'd never known anyone who couldn't sleep. My view was confirmed when, one night, I had witnessed Elvis going to sleep without taking his nightly packet at Graceland. If Elvis could do that once, I believed he could do it again. With practice, I thought, Elvis could learn to fall asleep unaided by sleep medicine over time, especially if he got out and exercised more. I began to question whether anybody had ever seriously tried to wean him off medication. I wanted Elvis to try going without the pills, or to at least try cutting back on the dosage. This definitely wasn't the time to bring up that tender subject, though. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but I loved him deeply, and I wasn't going to let over-the-top reactions like these deter me from trying to help him. I didn't say anything to my sisters about the juice incident. It was over, and Elvis was in a better mood. I was disturbed, however, that his cousins had seen Elvis angry, yet had never tried to intervene or ask me what happened. These people would become my family when Elvis and I were married. I wanted to feel close to them, but I was the newcomer. I wondered why they didn't go out of their way to approach me. I only had Elvis's best interests at heart, and wanted them to know that. In this moment, however, I was simply too embarrassed to confide in them, so I let things slide. On March 11th, Ed Parker set up an evening for us at the Polynesian Cultural Center at Brigham Young University so we could enjoy a night of Hawaiian dances. Elvis had his hair styled and wore a gorgeous two-piece black and white outfit with Native American beadwork on the cuffs and at the waist. He looked so handsome. I wanted to take a picture, but I was out of film, and so were my sisters. When we arrived at the center, we discovered that word of Elvis making an appearance had spread fast. Fans were milling about outside the roofed amphitheater, eager to see him. The show was already in progress when we walked inside. Thanks to the dim lighting, we were safely ushered to our seats. However, as soon as I sat down beside Elvis, a few audience members looked our way. Slowly, other heads began turning to stare. Many people seemed more interested in seeing Elvis than they were in watching the show. A man seated in front of us suddenly turned around, plopped his young daughter in Elvis's lap, and requested a photo. Elvis politely obliged. As Elvis held on to the little girl, he leaned my way, shrugged his shoulders, and joked, "He's not getting her back." I laughed, and was glad that others in the audience, who had also become aware of Elvis's presence, were courteous and let him enjoy the show. It was quite the spectacle, too. I'd never seen anything like it. There was a wide stage, tropical landscaping, waterfalls, and a spectacular mountain backdrop with volcanoes. Performers from all of the islands, in full costume with body and face paint, danced to the beat of drums and used fire, spears, and fans in their routines. Close to intermission, we were escorted to a private room so Elvis wouldn't be disturbed. After visiting with a few people, we returned for the second half of the show, but left shortly before the finale to avoid the crowd. Still, as we were walking toward the car, we suddenly became enveloped by fans. The driver opened the car door, and Elvis was able to make his way inside along with my sisters, but I got caught in the group. I panicked as the car slowly began pulling forward. Luckily, the rear door was still open, and a guard was able to help push me through the crowd. I scrambled into the car. It had been an amazing night, and I'd had a great time. I could tell Elvis had, too, since he talked about the show almost all the way back to the beach house. Yet the next day, Elvis again seemed to experience another inexplicable mood swing. I was standing in the kitchen talking with Rosemary when his stepbrother David Stanley walked by and playfully punched me on the top of my arm. "Keep your fucking hands off her," a voice exclaimed. Turning around in astonishment, I saw Elvis standing in the center of the hallway. Glaring at David, he angrily said, "You don't punch a lady. That's redneck shit." I was shocked by his fury. Where'd that come from? David was stunned too. "I was only joking," he yelled back at Elvis, then retreated. Elvis returned to his room and I followed him. His prior good mood had completely evaporated. He started talking about rednecks hitting ladies, and I tried to reassure him. "Elvis, David was only being playful," I said. But Elvis's mood wouldn't lift. "If David touches you again, I want to know," he said. I left things there, wondering whether Elvis was acting like this because he felt bad about the earlier incident, when he'd been the one to hit me. Elvis chose to mainly stay in his room that day, and I read with him for a little while. Later, I went outside with Rosemary and Terry. At one point, we began talking to David and Ricky. Shortly, someone came out and said Elvis wanted to see me. I returned to our room, where Elvis was seated on the bed. "What were you, Ricky, and David talking about?" he asked. Our bedroom window faced the lawn where we'd all been gathered outside. Now I realized Elvis must have been watching us. "Nothing in particular," I said. Did he think we were talking about him? Or could something else be going on between Elvis and his stepbrothers that I didn't know about? I didn't dare ask what was going on. I was still feeling a little tentative around Elvis after the juice incident and didn't want a chance upsetting him in any way. I chose to change the subject. Elvis never explained what he'd been worried about, but he continued to look at David in a strange way that day, as if he were trying to keep an eye on him. Elvis and I went down to the beach the following afternoon. The wind kicked up, blowing sand in his eyes, and they got irritated. Discouraged and uncomfortable, Elvis wasn't really able to enjoy himself now, so he decided it was time for us to head home. On March 13th, we boarded the plane back to the mainland. Elvis carried the mother-of-pearl crucifix he had purchased, but he dropped it and the base broke off. His frustrated mood quickly lightened when we entered the plane and saw a photo of Elvis when he pounced on top of Rosemary, taped to Elvis's bedroom door. We all got a chuckle out of that. During our return flight, Elvis mainly stayed in the back of the plane with my sisters and me again. At one point, he reflected on the trip and talked about how his guest invitations had escalated in number beyond what he'd expected. "Next time, I'm only taking about 8 people, Elvis said, adding that Dr. Nakopoulos had told him he wouldn't come unless his wife and daughters came too. "I'll never have that many again," he vowed. Elvis also wasn't pleased because one of his aides had popped up and told him he was quitting when we got back. He said he had paid for his trip, and the aide had decided to tell him this while he was trying to relax. Still, I was happy we'd gone to Hawaii. Not only because a dream of mine had come true, but because the trip had been good for Elvis overall. He had gone outside more and relaxed in a way I hadn't seen him do up until now. He'd also gotten to know my sisters better and really enjoyed their company. Elvis was a wonderful and caring person 98% of the time. His bad mood swings were out of character, and I now fully attributed them to the prescribed medication he'd been taking. I wanted to take care of him. I knew there would be challenges ahead. Love could be hard and steep, shaking us at our roots, but I was sure we could make it through.